Good evening. And tonight, the hidden history of the Rothschild family begins in Vienna, 1938, where the gilded rooms of the Palais Rothschild on Prinz-Eugenstrasse, heavy with hothouse roses and old leather and good tobacco, will soon give way to the carbolic soap corridors of the Hotel Metropole under swastika banners. And one of the strangest details in all of it is that the most elegant prisoner in Europe will still somehow receive a freshly pressed shirt at 6 in the morning. Glad to have Lachlan in Melbourne back again, and Fiona in Yorkshire too, since both commented on the last video and stayed until the end. If he feels like it, the listener can say where he is and what time it is in the comments, just like Lachlan and Fiona did, and gently like and subscribe, so these quiet evenings are waiting every time sleep needs a little help. Have you ever felt so tied to a place that leaving it seemed more unreal than staying? So the city draws near, and the doors open softly. The air in these rooms holds warm rose petals, beeswax, polished wood, cigar smoke gone sweet with age, and the faint dry dust of old canvas frames. At a desk where the passport is already gone, Louis lifts his monocle to the next sheet of paper, and somewhere below, Hubert is already coming up with a clean shirt. Only a little earlier, and also a lifetime earlier, Louis von Rothschild still moved through the Palais as if the house itself breathed with him. It stood on Prinz-Eugenstrasse with the calm confidence of money that had long ago stopped shouting. Its stone front was broad and exact. Its windows looked outward with the patient expression of a family that had bought the curtains, the silver, and most likely the view. Inside, the rooms opened one after another with a kind of gentle certainty. Gold trim caught the morning light, mirrors returned it in softer tones, carpets took in footsteps and gave almost nothing back. There were flowers in bowls that seemed too large even for those rooms. There were hothouse roses in winter. There were lilies in season. There were always arrangements planned so carefully that they looked accidental. The house had the usual grand features, though grand houses are often a little repetitive if one is honest. There were high ceilings. There were painted panels. There were mantel clocks that never seemed hurried, even when they were wrong. Paintings covered the walls with the composure of old ownership. Some were Dutch, some were French, some were Italian. Most had spent longer in Rothschild hands than in the rooms where they first hung. One Renoir in particular had the sort of pleasant, portable confusion that only a picture can manage. In later months, it would appear on official lists under several different room numbers. For now, it rested quietly where it belonged, and no one thought to make a note. The library smelled of bindings, dust, and tobacco that had settled into the leather years before. The dining room carried silver polish and old starch. The smaller sitting rooms smelled faintly of coal heat and perfume that had drifted from evening gowns and stayed behind. Louis liked rooms that were in use. He disliked the museum quality that often comes over rich houses. He preferred a chair slightly angled by a real person. He preferred a newspaper folded once and left on a side table. He preferred evidence that a life was being lived. He had grown into this taste naturally. The house was not a stage set to him. It was work. It was habit. It was family memory arranged under chandeliers. It was a place where people expected him to know where things were, and Louis usually did know. He knew which drawer held old shooting invitations. He knew where the private ledgers were kept. He knew which corridor stayed warmer in winter, and which footman could carry a tray level through almost any distraction. He also knew the exact minute coffee should appear. Hubert knew it too, of course, and knew it more sternly. Hubert treated the Baron's clothing and timetable as sacred facts of the universe. Empires might tilt. Governments might change signs over their doors. A shirt still needed proper studs. He was a thin man with the grave patience of a churchwarden and the shoulders of an overworked hanger. His face often wore a faint expression of professional martyrdom. It suggested he had personally been wronged by crumpled linen since birth. Each morning he entered carrying the first shirt over both forearms, as if it were a diplomatic instrument. The cotton was white in a way that almost seemed moral. The collar points were exact. The cuffs waited for gold links with quiet self-respect. Louis did not fuss over clothes, though people often assumed he must. He simply understood their use. A good coat was a kind of sentence. It said the wearer had risen, washed, sorted himself, and intended to remain composed. That morning ritual began in warmth and softness. Bath water was drawn to a temperature that never announced itself. Towels were thick and dry, Soap smelled faintly of almond. A silver-backed brush waited beside the basin on folded linen. The shaving things were laid out in the same order every day. Brush first, then soap, then razor, then the small glass bottle that Hubert believed absolutely essential, though its purpose may have been more moral than chemical. By the time Louis stood before the mirror, the room was no longer cool. Steam had softened the edges of the glass. A valet's invisible labor already sat everywhere in evidence. Fresh linen breathed faintly of starch and iron. Shoes reflected the carpet in dark curved flashes. Hubert helped him into the shirt with a tact that came from long practice. One sleeve, then the other, a pause at the shoulders, a small adjustment at the back. No unnecessary conversation was offered to the early hour. If the tie needed correcting, Hubert corrected it without comment. If the collar sat a millimeter wrong, Hubert suffered privately and repaired it. He communicated most of his thoughts through the angle of his ironing, which on some mornings could have been translated as deep constitutional concern. Louis's own contribution to the whole business was calm obedience. He submitted to cufflinks, waistcoat, and coat with the courtesy of a man who knew other people were better at the fastening. Then he reached for the monocle. The monocle had become an extension of his face in the way a cane becomes part of a walk. He lifted it not for drama, though it had dramatic effects. He lifted it to read figures, inspect letters, and give the impression that paperwork should make a proper effort before entering his day. On a silver tray near the window, coffee waited in a pot wrapped with a cloth cover to keep the heat. There were rolls under a napkin. There was butter in a small dish. There was honey. There was marmalade. There was usually one soft-boiled egg. The coffee mattered most. It was strong and dark, and served at the point between heat and bitterness that Louis preferred. He drank it from a thin cup that warmed the fingers without burning them. Even worry had to wait until after the first sip. He usually read while he ate. The morning paper lay folded in clean rectangles. Headlines came first, market notes followed, then letters, then memoranda, then the daily little parade of human demands and envelopes of varying importance. Vienna in those years still knew how to arrange a morning attractively. Delivery carts moved along streets washed pale by early light. Street cars rang from farther off. The city offered pastry, coffee, newspaper ink, and the illusion that these things together could keep history in good order. Louis knew better than most that order was built, not inherited. Still, he enjoyed the illusion while it was on offer. He enjoyed the coffee houses that made every table seem permanent. He enjoyed the familiar carriage turns near the ring. He enjoyed the little civil lies by which cities reassure themselves. He was, by that point, the sole remaining head of the Austrian banking house. His brothers had already made lives elsewhere. Their departures were practical decisions, and sensible ones, and no one needed a lecture on that fact from history. That left Louis with the old burden and the old dignity of staying put. He carried both with a dry manner and a good tailor. He was not theatrical. He was not sentimental in public. He simply continued to sit where the Austrian branch had always expected one Rothschild to sit. The family's connection to Austria had lasted more than a century. Money had built railways. Money had financed industry. Money had passed into hospitals, schools, museums, charities, and that quiet civic web by which cities flatter themselves into civilization. A dynasty can be discussed in ledgers, though it is never only ledgers. It also lives in habits. It lives in names on committee papers. It lives in endowments, foundation stones, guest lists, and in the odd practical question of who pays when a roof leaks over something culturally important. Louis understood this very well. He understood that large houses and old banks become symbols long before they become targets. He also understood that symbols cannot easily pack a valise and catch a train without making a point. So he remained in Vienna when others urged alternatives. He remained at his desk. He remained in the Palais. He remained in the pattern of lunches, calls, signatures, and meetings that had marked the family's place in the city for decades. His days were not glamorous in the way later gossip preferred. They were full of paper. There were balance sheets. There were letters from branch offices. There were committee requests. There were appeals from charities that relied on the old truth that the Rothschild name meant money and would most likely continue meaning money. He attended to those things with steadiness. He marked pages in pencil. He asked for figures to be checked twice. He looked at proposals through the monocle for a second longer than anyone found comfortable. This habit alone could make weak plans collapse from pure embarrassment. Visitors came through the morning rooms with the usual polished courtesy of Vienna society. A banker arrived, a lawyer arrived, a doctor's wife came regarding a fundraising event, a museum man came to discuss conservation, a cousin telephoned from somewhere with advice. The advice had begun to thicken by the mid-1930s. It came in person and by post. It came over lunch. It came after the opera. It came in careful language from people who did not wish to sound alarmed, and in less careful language from people who were alarmed enough for everyone. Sometimes the advice came by telegram from relatives abroad. Those telegrams had the brisk confidence of men safely in other capitals. They formed an early family group chat, if one is willing to forgive the wires their lack of punctuation and mercy. One cousin in London urged immediate movement of assets. Another relative in Paris recommended patience and discretion. A younger voice from New York could, within a single day, recommend departure, delay, refusal, compromise, and perhaps a good overcoat. Louis read them all. He placed them in order. He answered some. He set others aside under a paperweight with a horse on it. There are few objects as quietly judgmental as a paperweight used on family advice. Vienna's Jewish elite still maintained its social rounds, though the tone had changed. There were dinners. There were charity committees. There were subscriptions and concerts and formal calls. There were evenings where crystal and candlelight made stability seem almost rude to question. Jewish families who had long belonged to the city's upper layers still moved through a world of salons, hospitals, galleries, private music, and carefully managed obligations. Bankers met industrialists. Lawyers met publishers. Doctors sat beside patrons of the arts. Everybody knew several people who served on 3 boards too many. It was a cultivated world, and also a busy one. Good works had to be funded. Schools had to be supported. Musicians needed patrons. Buildings needed repair. Welfare groups needed regular, dull, unglamorous money, which is the most useful sort of money there is. The Rothschild name sat near the center of much of this. It carried prestige, certainly, but also expectation. People assumed the family would host, advise, contribute, underwrite, and appear. Wealth in such circles was not merely possession, it was a schedule. Louis navigated that schedule without flourish. He attended when attendance mattered. He gave when giving was required. He kept his manner measured enough that gratitude never turned sticky. He preferred practical help to emotional display, which spared many committees from themselves. He knew Vienna's manners almost too well. He knew which households would serve excellent cake and weak politics. He knew which hostesses seated financiers near musicians for spark and physicians near dukes for calm. He knew the faint strain hidden under polite laughter when Jewish success entered certain rooms. That strain was not new. Austria had long possessed a store of social prejudice that could be brought out like an old family silver tray. It had sat for years in jokes, exclusions, muttered comments, club rules, newspaper sneers, and that tiresome little tone people use when they wish to sound above things. By the mid-1930s, the tone had sharpened. Nazi talk moved across the border and into drawing rooms and cafes and student clubs. Symbols appeared where they had not been before. Men repeated slogans with a newly practiced confidence, as if they had taken lessons in being tedious. There were speeches in public squares. There were articles in ugly papers. There were boys with armbands and too much certainty. There were respectable people who disliked the noise and still somehow found ways to excuse it, which is a talent society often discovers at inconvenient moments. Louis noticed all this without becoming noisy about it. He was not a man for grand declarations at breakfast. He simply took in each new sign and folded it into the sum of what he knew. Then he finished his coffee. Friends did become more direct. A lawyer who had once spoken only of taxes began speaking of visas. A diplomat's wife stopped discussing upholstery and began discussing shipping routes. A priest with good manners and a worried face suggested caution in terms so delicate they almost evaporated. The advice always came down to the same thing. Leave while leaving is still an orderly act. Leave while the timetable remains on the wall. Leave while the door is still called a door and not yet an arrangement. Louis listened. He always listened. Then he sat very still, with the monocle catching light, and gave answers that were courteous enough to be maddening. He had obligations. He had staff. He had the bank. He had responsibilities, that did not fit easily into trunks. He also had a deep and almost old-fashioned attachment to Austria itself. This could strike outsiders as surprising, though attachment is usually surprising only to people who are not feeling it. He belonged to the place in a practical, daily sense. He knew its weather, its officials, its roads, its habits, its rudenesses, and its graces. To leave would not merely mean travel. It would mean admitting that the long settlement between family and country had come apart. It would mean saying aloud that a century of contribution had not earned even the ordinary right to remain unmolested in one's own rooms. That was not an easy sentence for him to accept. So the days went on in their elegant pattern. A carriage arrived, a caller was shown in, lunch was served at the proper hour, the silver was counted back into its drawer, the flowers were refreshed, new letters appeared as if the house itself printed worries overnight. Even the servants absorbed the changing mood in their own practical way. Footmen lowered voices in corridors. Secretaries sharpened pencils with unnecessary force. Hubert became, if possible, even more devoted to correct collars, as though a clean cuff might hold the frontier in place a few weeks longer. There is comfort in ritual, precisely because ritual makes no great claims. It asks only that the tie be straight. It asks only that the tray arrive warm. It suggests that one can still place socks in a drawer by color, while history shuffles its heavier furniture elsewhere. Louis never mocked that comfort. He relied on it. The order of his room, the order of breakfast, the order of files on the desk, all formed a small republic of sense. Within that republic, numbers still added up, and a note answered promptly was still considered an achievement. He spent part of many mornings with the bank's papers. Figures from industry crossed his desk. Reports from clients crossed it too. There were concerns about credit, pressure on markets, nervous movement of capital, and those subtle tremors by which money announces it has heard gossip before the newspapers do. He had a good head for such things. He could read unease in a column of numbers the way other men read rain in a window. He knew when a client's confidence had thinned. He knew when outward calm masked hurried rearrangement. Still, business itself remained oddly ordinary. Men continued discussing rates and holdings and contracts, because men will discuss rates and holdings almost up to the edge of any abyss. It is one of the more dependable features of civilization, though not always one of the noblest. Afternoons brought other duties. There might be a committee meeting about a hospital fund. There might be a visit from a curator discussing frames and storage. There might be a call concerning horses, estates, or some charitable subscription no one else had remembered until it became urgent. These tasks were not distractions from the real world. They were the real world, or at least the one worth protecting. A hospital roof mattered. A scholarship mattered. A museum mattered. Bread and butter decency often looks boring on paper, which is unfair to decency. At dinner, conversation moved between culture and caution. A violinist might be praised. A new production at the opera might be discussed. Then someone, almost idly, would mention Berlin. Another guest would mention local disturbances. Then the soup would arrive, and everyone would apply themselves to it with great seriousness. The soup itself may as well be recorded, because soup does a good deal of quiet historical work. It was often clear broth, with root vegetables cut small enough to show respect. Sometimes there were tiny dumplings, sometimes parsley floated on top in chopped green flecks. Sometimes the bowl warmed the hands just enough to make politics seem briefly less inventive. Vienna could still produce splendid meals while reassuring itself. There were veal dishes with cream sauce. There were potatoes glossed in butter. There were little pastries with apricot. There was coffee again afterward, because coffee in Vienna behaves less like a drink and more like a constitutional principle. In such rooms, the question of leaving could sound almost indecent. The tablecloth was white, the silver shone, the servant poured quietly. How could a city built on this much ritual fail so badly in its duties to some of its own citizens? Yet polished silver has never been a legal guarantee. Louis kept his tone even when others did not. He refused panic partly by temperament and partly by discipline. Panic, he believed, made people stupid and untidy. He disliked both outcomes. There was also pride involved, though not the noisy kind. He did not wish to be chased from Vienna, like a man surprised in borrowed rooms. The palais was not borrowed. The bank was not borrowed. The family's place had been paid for over generations in labor, skill, money, and public usefulness. If he left too quickly, he felt he would abandon more than furniture and files. He would abandon servants who depended on the house. He would abandon clerks who needed direction. He would abandon an Austrian story in which his family had long played a central part, and he was not ready to admit the story had been edited without consent. In modern terms, the coming annexation would prove history's most catastrophic merger, carried out with no due diligence and certainly no shareholder vote. For now, though, it still looked to many Viennese like noise that might pass, or at least be negotiated into something smaller and less vulgar. Louis had spent enough time in finance to know that hostile takeovers often arrive wrapped in confident language. That did not mean he welcomed one. It simply meant he understood how men with bad intentions like to describe themselves as practical. There were days when the city felt unchanged. Cabs still rolled, shop windows still displayed gloves and silk. A child still licked pastry sugar from a thumb outside a cafe. A florist still argued over peonies as if peonies were the axis of Europe. Then there were days when the street itself seemed to hold its breath. More flags appeared. More hostile talk was overheard. Faces looked away too quickly, or stared too long. Familiar places gained an extra edge, like a room after someone has moved one chair by an inch. Louis noticed those inches. He noticed who called less often. He noticed who sounded suddenly hearty. He noticed the strange eagerness of certain lesser officials, as if they had been waiting years for a chance to become important by filling out forms against other people. Even so, his own habits held. He rose at the same time. He dressed with the same care. He took the same coffee. He read the same papers, though they became worse company. He moved through the same rooms whose beauty had begun quietly to feel like a challenge thrown at coarseness. Sometimes he paused before a painting longer than usual, not because he feared losing it that day. The mind is subtler than that. It simply lingers when the world outside begins speaking in rougher tones. In the music room, polished wood gave back the light in deep amber bands. In the reception rooms, gilding warmed toward honey by afternoon. In the gallery spaces, canvases looked down with that detached patience unique to art, which has seen many governments come and go, and is rarely impressed by any of them. There were moments when the house seemed almost to encourage him, not in any mystical sense. Grand buildings are simply very persuasive about continuity. Staircases imply tomorrow. Long corridors imply routine. A row of well-kept doors suggests that opening and closing them properly is still a meaningful form of order. Friends continued to press him. One came for tea and spoke more plainly than before. Another sent a message asking whether arrangements had been made for departure. A third, after much circling, finally said that staying had ceased to look brave and was beginning to look unsafe. Louis replied that a head of house did not vanish at the first unpleasant sound. He replied that Austrian law still existed. He replied that public standing had some value. He replied, in essence, that the thing could not possibly become quite as vulgar as all that. History, as usual, was preparing a vulgarity far beyond anyone's conversational comfort. Still, it would be wrong to present him as merely stubborn. There was principle in the decision. There was loyalty. There was also the dense web of practical details that make departure much harder for the well-established, and novelists like to admit. A house like the Palais was not a suitcase with curtains. It held archives, collections, staff households, papers, investments, obligations, and all the material weight of a family that had lived seriously in one place. Leaving such a place required not only courage, but inventory, which is a less poetic demand and often the more powerful one. And Louis had the banker's respect for inventory. He knew what things were. He knew what they were worth. He knew which objects belonged to private rooms and which to family trust. He knew where plate, ledgers, paintings, and title papers rested, and that knowledge tethered him more firmly than any speech. His remaining, then, was made of many strands. Duty was one, habit was another, pride certainly, love of country, however bruised, faith in law, perhaps too generous, responsibility toward the Austrian house, responsibility toward the people paid through it, responsibility toward a version of Vienna that still existed in his memory and in several very good dining rooms. There is something deeply human in believing tomorrow will resemble yesterday if one has polished the silver properly enough. Louis was too intelligent for that belief in its simple form, yet even he held some gentler version of it. The city encouraged such thinking. Vienna specialized in surfaces that promised endurance. Facades were maintained, orchestras performed, cakes arrived dusted with sugar, officials stamped papers. One could be forgiven for assuming the machinery of daily life would reject open barbarity as poor manners. It did not, of course, but poor manners can travel astonishingly far when given uniforms. For now, though, March had not yet fully broken over him. The palais still held its roses. The carpets still softened each step. The old leather and good tobacco still marked the library air. And on the table beside his hand, the coffee had not yet gone cold. Hubert entered once more with the next garment arranged over his arms. He gave the tiniest look toward the weather beyond the window. It was the sort of look that suggested clouds were personally responsible for the state of Europe. Louis accepted the jacket, rose and turned slightly toward the mirror. The monocle flashed once in the morning light. Downstairs another message had arrived. Somewhere in Vienna, another friend was deciding whether to press him again. And in the calm of the palais before the city finally gave itself away, Baron Louis von Rothschild adjusted a cuff, reached for the first letter, and remained exactly where he had chosen to remain. The morning began with roses that were trying a little too hard. They warmed the gilded reception rooms with a heavy house scent. Old leather sat beneath it. Good tobacco lingered in the curtains from evenings that had seemed permanent. Hubert entered with a shirt held out like a peace treaty with no conditions attached. He had found a fresh one somewhere in the palace linen supply. This felt both normal and faintly miraculous. His face wore the same mild sorrow it always wore while saving civilization through collars. Louis stood still while the studs were fixed. The linen was cool first. Then it settled against his skin and took on his warmth.
Hubert drew the cuff straight with two exact little tugs that suggested the world could still be persuaded.
A tie appeared next. Its dark silk caught a dull blue shine from the window. Hubert tied it with priestly care. He seemed convinced that a correct knot would remain correct, even if Europe did not. Breakfast waited on a low table near the tall windows. There was coffee in a silver pot that kept its heat rather well. There were rolls wrapped in a cloth napkin. There was butter in a glass dish and an egg in a cup with a cracked shell top. The radio murmured to itself from the next room. It had been speaking almost all night in that strained, polite tone radios develop before history does something rude. A servant had turned the knob down twice. The voice still slipped under doors like a draft. Louis took the first coffee while standing. He liked the bitter smell before the sugar went in. He liked the first small burn on the tongue. He liked most of all the illusion that mornings obeyed a schedule. Outside, Vienna had not yet decided what face to put on. The street looked washed and ordinary in the pale light. A milk cart passed slowly. A woman in a dark coat adjusted her hat with both hands and walked on. Then the radio made the morning choose. The announcer sharpened his tone. German troops were crossing the Austrian border on March 12, 1938. The sentence landed in the room with the dry neatness of a bill being presented. Louis did not hurry to the set. He finished one piece of toast first. He set down the knife so it rested exactly across the plate. Then he went into the next room and listened to the map being rewritten before breakfast was finished. The words were brisk and falsely cheerful. They named roads and towns as if reading train times. They named unity as if it were a helpful household repair. They named the movement of troops the way a banker might name a merger already signed somewhere else. It was, in modern terms, a hostile takeover without an appointment. There had been no shareholder vote. There had been no due diligence. The most catastrophic merger in Europe was being announced before the eggs had cooled. Louis adjusted his monocle and listened a little longer. It sat in place with its usual faint air of criticism. The announcer would not have enjoyed being examined through it. A bell rang in the corridor. Another servant came with the morning papers before the ink felt entirely dry. The sheets were damp at the fold. Their headlines already seemed older than the voice on the radio. Hubert returned to place the jacket. He brushed one invisible speck from the sleeve and another from the lapel. Political arrangements might collapse in the street below. A shoulder seam still needed to sit cleanly. Louis went back to the tall windows with his coffee. From there he could see a stretch of pavement and the tops of waiting cars. He could also see people beginning to stop, turn, and gather in little knots that had not been there minutes earlier. Flags came out with suspicious speed. A boy ran carrying one twice his width. A woman leaned from an upper floor and shook out red cloth with a white disc at the center. It looked less like a decision than like laundry with ambition. The city found its voice by degrees. First there was talking, then there was calling. Then came that rolling street noise made when many shoes move in one direction, and no one quite knows why he is hurrying. The tram bells sounded thin inside it. A flower seller pushed her cart to the curb and stood very still. A baker crossed his arms in his doorway and watched. Two men laughed with the excited stiffness of men trying on a new opinion. On another corner, shutters came down. They came down carefully at first, then faster. The wood panels met with flat, hard sounds that traveled farther than the cheering. A gold-lettered shop sign vanished behind slats. A clerk inside reached up and turned the sign to closed. The movement was small and everyday. That was what made it so sad and strange. Jewish families had heard the same radio. They did not cheer in the windows. They counted keys and papers. They closed drawers, lifted cash boxes, and spoke in the quick, level voices used when one must not frighten children or servants. Across the street, a maid took in a rug from a balcony. She shook it once because habit is strong. Dust floated briefly in the cold light. Then she rolled it and carried it indoors like something that might need protecting. Louis watched all this without touching the glass. The pain held a faint chill. His coffee cooled unnoticed in his hand. Behind him, the room still smelled of roses that had been cut yesterday for a world that no longer existed. The radio continued with fresh assurances. The word order appeared often. So did the word German. Austria seemed to be shrinking in real time into a phrase used by men already past it. Telephones began their morning exercise. One rang in the study. Another sounded deeper in the house. Somewhere downstairs a servant answered, and then lowered his voice at once. The first caller spoke too quickly to be calm. He was an old contact with a law office near the ring. He said troops had crossed early and were advancing without resistance. He said Louis must understand that this was no temporary commotion. Louis asked whether the bank had opened. The question was plain and almost domestic. A bank opens or does not open. The answer came after a pause that lasted long enough to show its shape. No one knew yet. Clerks were trying to reach Rengasse. Some had turned back at the sight of flags and marching men. Others had gone on because people trained in ledgers will try the office first and panic later. Louis thanked him and replaced the receiver gently. He did not slam it. He did not pace. He adjusted one cuff and looked again toward the street, where the crowd had doubled while the coffee had cooled. Hubert appeared with a second cup as if summoned by the weakness of the first. No one had called for him. He simply understood these things. The fresh coffee smelled stronger, as if the beans themselves had been advised to stand firm. By then the cheering had found rhythm. A motor convoy passed somewhere beyond sight and was greeted with a sound like a great door opening. Faces lifted. Arms rose. Windows filled. There were smiles of pure excitement. There were smiles of relief at belonging to the larger noise. There were also faces that stayed blank. Those vanished quickly from public view, which was practical and very Viennese. A woman from a nearby apartment building leaned out too far in her haste. Her husband caught her by the back of the skirt and pulled her in. She reappeared a moment later with a better grip and the same flag. The city was having one of its less graceful mornings. Not every door opened to celebrate. A tailor in the next block turned his key twice and kept the curtain closed. A doctor's brass plate had already been unscrewed from one entrance. It left a clean square on the wood where respectability had recently hung. A delivery boy stood holding 3 parcels and no instructions. He looked from one address to another with the grave misery of the truly inconvenienced. History often arrives like this for ordinary people. It ruins the route before it ruins the afternoon. Louis moved from the window to the writing desk. He spread the newspapers beside a silver paper knife. One front page carried a photograph prepared before the day had properly begun. That speed alone told him how long the night had really been. There had been warnings before this. There had been speeches, pressure, meetings, and men who mistook appetite for policy. Yet the actual crossing of a border made everything less theoretical in the space of one sentence. The household footman brought in a tray with correspondence. Letters tied in ribbons sat beneath 2 calling cards. One envelope had a London postmark. Another had been redirected twice and looked as tired as a traveler changing trains. Louis set the private letters aside. He reached instead for a memorandum from the bank. Its page smelled faintly of carbon paper. The typing was neat until the last line, where the machine had struck too hard. The message said men had arrived at Rengasse. They were in gray uniforms. They were not clients. They had entered as though invited by a door that belonged to no one in particular. The Rothschild banking house had stood there for generations. Its floors knew the sound of clerks, messengers, and polished shoes. Its counters knew the weight of ledgers and gloves. Its windows had looked out on Vienna through every sort of weather and opinion. Now its ownership had become overnight a problem to be solved by strangers. The stranger's method was simple: a seal on a cabinet, a guard at a desk, a new authority sitting in an old chair, and asking for keys as if asking for more ink. One cashier tried to explain normal procedure. This was a brave instinct and a useless one. The men in gray were not interested in procedure unless it helped them sign faster. They wanted lists, room numbers, and names of account books. A second call confirmed it. Jewish businesses across the city were being entered, tagged, and claimed with astonishing speed. Shops, warehouses, offices, and apartments were turning into paperwork before their owners had finished breakfast. There is something dreary about theft done with forms. It lacks even the honesty of ordinary burglary. It comes with stamps and signatures. It expects gratitude for its efficiency. Louis read the memorandum twice, then he placed it squarely beside the butter dish, which felt like the correct level of ceremony. The butter had softened while the bank had been seized. Both facts belonged to the same morning. Hubert reappeared to ask, with severe tact, whether outdoor shoes might now be preferable. Louis said yes. The polished pair arrived at once. Their leather gleamed like still water. Hubert knelt with the expression of a man suffering nobly through other people's politics. He brushed one trouser cuff before Louis stepped into the first shoe. Then he brushed it again, after the second. There are standards that survive annexation. Hubert intended to enforce them personally. More calls followed. A family friend from the diplomatic world spoke in careful phrases because lines might be heard. An industrialist with excellent suits and poor nerves said the city was changing by the minute. A priest said little but breathed loudly, which meant concern. All said the same thing in different clothing. Louis must leave Vienna within the next few hours. He must go at once, while roads remained open and before names became lists. He must choose inconvenience over dignity and speed over habit. It was sound advice. It arrived in such quantity that it began to resemble weather. Each call carried the same pressure. Each caller believed he had discovered urgency personally and should deliver it fresh. Louis listened with the grave patience of a man hearing estimates for repairs. He asked practical questions. Which roads, which trains, which frontier still moved? Had passports been examined carefully, or only waved through in the confusion? A friend from the airport said a small plane might be arranged. A cousin's solicitor suggested Switzerland by car. Someone else argued for Czechoslovakia at once. A fourth insisted that Paris remained safest, which was a large thing to promise before luncheon. Louis thanked them all. He stood by the desk with the receiver in hand, while another connection was sought. The cord coiled against the polished wood like a black snake pretending to be office equipment. He glanced toward the portrait walls. Ancestors watched from frames that had survived cleaner wars and quieter humiliations. Their painted collars were magnificent. Their opinions on aviation appeared unavailable. Leaving was not only about one man in a coat. There were servants in the house. There were family papers in locked cabinets. There were collections, obligations, accounts, and people whose wages traveled through his signature every month. There was also Vienna itself. A person may know perfectly well when a city has become dangerous. He may still struggle to believe that the door should be closed behind him forever. Carpets and staircase turns can make cowards of sensible men. A knock at the study door brought the first telegram. Then came a second before the first had been opened. Then a third. By noon the household had developed the look of a post office with upholstery. The telegram forms were stiff and unpleasant to touch. Their paper had a dry, crackling feel. Their glue smelled faintly sour. Their language, once unfolded, managed to sound both urgent and oddly mechanical. Cousin Anthony from London advised immediate acceptance of practical terms. He did not specify which terms, because new ones were arriving hourly. He urged calm, speed, and realism. These are easy words to cable from another country. Uncle Robert from Paris sent the opposite. Under no circumstances, he declared. The phrase filled most of the page and all of the mood. It sounded as if he had struck the telegraph key with his walking stick. A nephew in New York then achieved something special. He sent 3 messages in one afternoon. Together they recommended both accepting and refusing any Nazi demands. They did this in 17 words, in the spirit of a man missing sleep. The Rothschild telegram chain had begun in earnest. It was essentially the first family group chat. Like all group chats, everyone gave different advice at exactly the same time, and considered this deeply helpful. A servant brought the cable tray in with both hands. Silver forms slid against one another like oversized playing cards. The tray grew heavier each hour, so did the room. Louis opened them with the paper knife. He read each one through the monocle. He held the sheet a shade too long. The effect was devastating, even when the intended victim was a telegraph clerk several countries away. The monocle did not hurry. It inspected panic from London and stubbornness from Paris with equal reserve. It suggested that family alarm, while understandable, might have been phrased more elegantly. Between cables, the phones kept ringing. One banker advised getting funds out immediately. Another replied that funds no longer moved by mere wishing. A third asked after Louis's health, before urging flight with the desperate politeness of an overtrained spaniel. Outside, the street had become louder still. Cars moved with flags tied to their hoods. Men ran alongside them for no useful reason. The cheering rose and fell in waves, like weather over stone. Yet quieter movements continued in doorways and back halls. A woman carrying 2 hat boxes entered a building without lifting her head. An elderly man tucked a shop ledger under his coat and walked as if it were bread. Someone had thought to save account books before China. At Rengas, the bank's clerks were now being sorted by category. Those considered acceptable were told to wait. Those considered unacceptable were told, in effect, that the desks no longer knew them. Papers were taken from hands that had balanced them for decades. A messenger came directly from the bank in the early afternoon. He had dust on his cuffs and a missing button. He smelled of cold air, sweat, and street tram grease. He also smelled faintly of fear, which is a sharp, thin smell and hard to ignore. Louis had him seated and given tea first. The cup rattled once against the saucer. Then it steadied. The messenger reported that uniformed men had occupied the offices and demanded immediate inventories. They wanted cash reserves listed. They wanted securities, private papers, safe contents, and names of trusted staff. They wanted to know who held which keys. They wanted everything arranged in columns so that theft could feel administrative. One officer had asked after the art. This seemed almost touching in its vulgarity. He had not asked with love or knowledge. He had asked the way a child asks what else comes in the hamper. The messenger said portraits were being noted. The silver in meeting rooms had been counted. Desk drawers were emptied onto green felt. Someone had even written down the clocks, which suggested a soul fully devoted to pettiness. Louis asked whether any staff had been struck. The messenger said no. He said there had been shouting and shoving of papers, but no beatings there. The horror of the morning remained mostly clerical, which was enough. That answer softened the room by 1 degree. Tea was poured again. A plate of biscuits appeared as if discussion of inventories naturally required them. In old houses, biscuits often arrive when civilization is trying to reassure itself. Another warning came before the messenger had left. This one arrived by private note from a sympathetic official who preferred not to telephone. He wrote that Louis's name was already being spoken in places where names should never be spoken. The note advised immediate departure. Not when trunks had been packed properly, within hours, while confusion still covered gaps and before orders settled into tidy lines. Louis folded the note into fourths. He slid it beneath a silver letter weight shaped like a hound. The dog held down the warning with loyal brass paws. It looked absurd and almost kind. Hubert entered to announce that the motor car could be ready in 10 minutes. He spoke as if discussing a theater engagement slightly endangered by drizzle. He also mentioned gloves, because flight from a capital city should not mean fingerprints on the leather. Louis thanked him and asked for the gray overcoat. Hubert produced it at once from a wardrobe deep enough to have its own weather. He held it while Louis slid in one arm and then the other, as carefully as on any ordinary day. The coat smelled faintly of cedar and winter. Its lining was smooth at the shoulders from use. A pair of gloves waited in the pocket. Hubert had thought of everything except, regrettably, the disintegration of the Austrian state. Another telegram arrived while the overcoat was being buttoned. Anthony again. He now urged leaving at once and yielding nothing later, which was admirably firm and logically untidy. Uncle Robert then repeated under no circumstances in a second table, just in case memory had failed. Louis removed one glove to open them. Hubert watched this with deep injury, because gloves once on should remain on until the world is calmer. The world was offering no such cooperation. The study desk began to look like a minor rail station, messages stacked by destination, telephone numbers sprawled in pencil, calling cards rested beneath ashtrays. Vienna itself seemed to be turning into slips of paper passed by anxious men. A family solicitor arrived in person. His hat was damp from mist and excitement. He had come through streets thick with flags and shouted greetings not meant for him. His first act on entering was to wipe his spectacles, because vision felt negotiable outdoors. He urged Louis to leave immediately by car. He had mapped one route on the back of an envelope. It avoided the busiest squares and several roads already choked with celebration. He spoke without sitting down, which made his urgency sway gently. Louis asked whether he had eaten. The solicitor blinked at the question as though lunch had been abolished by decree. A tray was ordered. He accepted tea and half a roll, while continuing to advise escape between bites. This slowed him pleasantly. Butter has that effect on professional alarm. So does warm china. For 3 minutes he sounded almost reasonable. Then the telephone rang again. A contact from government circles said the new authorities were already identifying major Jewish fortunes for seizure. Banks, factories, estates, and collections were being treated as ripe fruit on a table suddenly considered public. Louis said he understood. He did understand in the abstract. He also understood the placement of every room in the palais, the habits of every servant, and the exact tone the floor made near the west gallery. The crowd outside now sang. The sound rose through the window glass in thick, uneven bursts. It was cheerful in the way of people enjoying a parade and not asking where the route ends. Cheer can be one of history's most unsettling noises. On the far side of the street, another Jewish household was closing. A maid carried out a stack of ledgers and placed them in a trunk. A child held the lid, while an older woman searched her reticule for the key. Their movements were quick, but still tidy. No one likes to travel with bad packing. That small dignity persisted all over the city that day. Families tied bundles, pinned labels, folded collars, and wrapped spoons and handkerchiefs while the public squares discovered ecstasy. Louis moved once more to the tall window. He stood with one hand behind his back and the other holding the leather glove he had not yet put on. Below him, Vienna seemed determined to become someone else before evening. He could have gone then. The motor car was ready. Routes had been proposed. Advice had been delivered in 4 countries in 2 tones of panic. Yet going requires the body to accept what the mind has only just admitted. He remained where he was for another minute, then for another. The roses in the next room had grown sweeter in the warmth. They were near their last day and smelled extravagantly alive. There would be time, everyone said. There would be no time, everyone else said. The difference between those views was now being measured in street corners and signatures. The telegram chain kept breeding. A Paris cousin asked whether certain paintings had been moved. A London aunt requested news of the servants. Someone in New York cabled only the word answer, which was not really a question, but had great force. Louis finally sat to write replies. His fountain pen scratched softly over heavy cream paper. He wrote in the measured hand of a man trained never to quarrel with stationery. Short assurances went out because longer ones would have been fiction. He said he had received their messages. He said the situation was grave. He said arrangements were being considered. He did not say that every arrangement already seemed late. By late afternoon, reports from Rengos had hardened into certainty. The banking house was seized. Officials were in possession of rooms, files, and access points. Men who had not previously owned it were acting with all the confidence ownership can borrow from a uniform. The thing was done with astonishing speed. Accounts that had taken decades to build were reduced to cupboards and lists in a single day. Trust, which is invisible and slow, was being treated as furniture that could be inventoried before supper. The palace had grown strangely quiet. Servants spoke less, doors closed more gently. Even the clock seemed to tick with professional discretion. Hubert laid out fresh linen for the evening. This was either optimism or discipline. Perhaps they are the same in a proper household. He also set a dark suit on the valet stand, as if tomorrow had already sent its requirements. Louis touched the sleeve and looked toward the window once more. The city outside still roared. Inside, the cloth felt smooth and cool beneath his fingers. It belonged to a world of fittings, dinners, and correct waistcoat buttons. For a moment he simply stood there. He was the sole head of the Austrian banking house. He was custodian of 130 years of family wealth. He was also a man in a room, listening to telephones and deciding whether departure had already become an afterthought. Another telegram arrived at precisely the wrong moment, which was by then the family style. It advised courage, caution, immediate departure, and strategic patience in 18 words. Only a relation could send 4 instructions at once and feel efficient. Louis read it through the monocle. Then he placed it on the stack with the others and allowed himself the smallest breath through the nose. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man recognizing his family under any regime. Evening had not yet fallen. Still, the day already felt complete in the way bad days do. Breakfast belonged to another century. The border had been crossed, the streets had chosen their mood, and the bank on Rengas had been turned into a file. In the fading light, the palace held its scent: roses, leather, tobacco, a little coffee gone stale in the cup near the window. Hubert coughed discreetly from the doorway and asked whether the Baron would change for dinner. The question was absurd. It was also exactly right. Louis turned from the telegrams and said that yes, of course he would. Morning sat lightly over Prince Eugenstrasse, as if the city had not yet chosen its expression. In the Palais Rothschild, the air still held hothouse roses, old leather, and the last trace of good tobacco. Louis von Rothschild was dressed as if the day intended to behave in a normal way. Hubert had laid out the shirt with the calm severity of a priest arranging altar cloth. The linen was white enough to look faintly blue in the early light. The collar stood firm and cool against the neck. Cufflinks waited in a small dish near the washstand. A dark tie lay across the chair with a precise, almost reproachful neatness. Hubert said very little, because Hubert always said very little when shirts were involved. He moved with the grave purpose of a man who believed wrinkles were moral weakness. Political upheaval, in his view, was regrettable, but secondary to proper pressing. Louis put on one sleeve, then the other, with his usual unhurried care. He settled the cuffs. He drew the tie through his fingers once, as if testing the grain of the silk. On the table stood a cup that had gone only slightly cool. Beside it sat a spoon, a folded napkin, and a small plate with untouched toast. The silver had been polished the day before. It shone with the quiet confidence of old household habits. Outside, a motor car waited. Its engine made a patient, steady sound in the courtyard. Somewhere farther off, a tram bell rang. Vienna still knew how to sound like Vienna, even while it changed its banners. Louis took up his hat and gloves. He checked his papers in the leather case without any sharpness or fuss. The case smelled faintly of hide and paper dust. It had held more cheerful documents on other mornings. A servant opened the door. Another kept his eyes lowered in the careful way households adopt when the air feels uncertain. No one rushed. That was one of Louis's habits, and also one of his principles. He went down the stairs with the measured tread of a man who had never run for trains, opinions, or governments. The banister was smooth under the hand. The carpet softened each step into almost no sound at all. On the walls hung paintings that had watched generations come down those stairs in evening dress and morning coats. One Renoir, at least for that morning, remained exactly where it had been left. This would not stay simple for long. The city outside wore March weather. The air was cool and a little damp, with the soft smell of stone after night mist. Flags had appeared with startling speed. They hung from windows like fabric declarations made in a hurry. The car moved through streets that Louis knew so well he barely needed to look. Yet he did look. He saw shop shutters, newspaper boards, milk carts, and clusters of people standing too still on corners. There were uniforms where there had been fewer uniforms the week before. There were salutes where there had once been hats. In modern terms, Vienna had just undergone history's most catastrophic merger. No shareholder vote had been held, and due diligence had been entirely skipped. Louis sat back against the leather seat. He kept his gloves on. The driver said nothing. Silence in a car can be many things, and that morning it was mostly tact. At Aspern Airfield, the wind felt larger. It crossed the open ground with a clean bite and the smell of fuel. Propellers turned somewhere ahead with a low chopping thrum. A mechanic pushed a trolley that rattled over the concrete. The terminal was not grand. It was a practical place of counters, windows, signs, and people pretending to be very occupied. A woman in a hat pinned with a small veil adjusted her suitcase strap. A clerk licked a finger before turning a page. Louis stepped from the car and smoothed one glove. He looked exactly like a man about to travel. That, for several more seconds, remained true in his own mind. Then two men detached themselves from the waiting area with the plain efficiency of bad news. They wore coats suited to official purpose. One carried a folder swollen with papers. The other had the expression of a man who trusted paper more than people. He asked for Baron Louis von Rothschild, in a tone that suggested the answer was regrettably obvious. Louis stopped. He did not step back, or sideways, or anywhere else dramatic. He merely inclined his head. Then he waited for the paperwork, because there was clearly going to be paperwork. The folder opened with a dry rustle. Several sheets emerged, some typed and some stamped. The stamps were fresh enough to shine. The signatures beneath them were broad and eager. Louis raised his monocle and examined the top page in silence. The monocle never hurried. It gave every demand the faintly sorrowful attention of a connoisseur assessing a wine that had not quite made the grade. The official cleared his throat. The second official shifted his weight and looked past Louis toward the aircraft. From the edge of the field came the smell of oil and wet grass. Somewhere a telephone rang for an absurdly long time. The words used at the airport were official words. They were about custody, authority, and the requirements of the state. They were also, stripped of polish, the opening move in Europe's most aggressive hostile takeover of a family office. No appointment had been made. Louis handed over his travel papers when asked. He did not hand them over as if surrendering anything. His fingers were dry and steady. The leather case stayed tucked under his arm until someone specifically requested it. That small detail unsettled them more than it should have. Men with sudden power often expect a tremor, and he offered them none. A porter paused nearby with a trunk on a trolley. He stared, then stared very carefully somewhere else. The clerk at the counter kept writing. Ink blotched at the edge of his ledger where his hand hesitated. There was no scene. There was only a ring of chilly air, the scrape of shoes, and the stiff choreography of an arrest trying to look administrative. Louis asked whether his driver should be informed. One official said that arrangements would be made. He asked if his hat might remain with him. After a short consultation, the hat was permitted. Such moments matter in old houses and new prisons alike. Civilization often survives first as a hat, a collar, or a correctly folded handkerchief. He was led back toward the car, though not his own this time. The official folder came too, because it seemed to be in charge. A second vehicle waited with dust along the lower doors. Its interior smelled of wool coats, fuel, and cold vinyl. The road back into Vienna passed fields that had not asked to be historical. They sat under the pale sky and minded their own furrows. Louis watched them with the same attention he had given the warrant. Looking calmly is also a kind of action. The city grew thicker around them. Church towers rose above roofs, and banners crossed streets in bright, hard colors. At corners stood men who had discovered that standing at corners can feel like participation. They looked important, in the way waiting men often do. The car turned toward the old city. It did not return to Prinz-Eugen-Strasse. Instead, it stopped before the Hotel Metropole, which had once greeted travelers and now greeted dossiers. The building still carried the bones of hospitality. One could see it in the doorway, the sweep of the entrance, and the lingering curve of old decorative plaster. But the welcome mat had become a guard post. The chandeliers had given way to bare bulbs with no patience for mood. Inside, the smell changed at once. Carbolic soap sat over everything like a stern schoolmistress. Under that came damp wool, cigarette smoke, old polish, and the stale warmth of crowded offices. The lobby had lost its old ease. Furniture had been shifted into usefulness, and usefulness is rarely flattering to furniture. Tables held stacks of forms where flower bowls might once have stood. Boots crossed floors once meant for evening shoes. A young guard at the entrance looked at Louis, then at his superior, then at Louis again. He seemed mildly disappointed that one of Austria's richest men looked so entirely like a man who expected proper breakfast service. The registration desk had become a station for names, confiscations, and receipts. An ink pad sat beside a metal stamp. Next to it lay a ruler, some string, and a chipped cup full of pencils sharpened with excessive force. Louis was asked to state his name, title, date of birth, and place of residence. He did so in an even voice. He gave each answer its full shape, as if the language itself deserved decent handling. His watch was noted. His case was noted. His handkerchief was very nearly noted, which seemed to Louis a promising sign for future administrative absurdity. A clerk wrote on carbon paper and pressed too hard. The copy beneath came out fainter and slightly askew. The monocle went back into place when a receipt was offered. Louis read that too. If the officers had hoped for pleading, anger, or visible fear, they had chosen an unusually inconvenient prisoner. They had, without quite grasping it yet, detained a man whose chief skill was remaining composed in rooms full of overreaching men. Commissar Halbwachs entered halfway through the process. He carried another form and the air of a man already late for his own tension. He was not tall, though his paperwork tried to add inches. His collar sat too tight by lunchtime and never improved. He introduced himself with a clipped official manner. Louis acknowledged him with a courteous tilt of the head. Then Halbwachs produced a second inventory sheet, as if abundance of forms might settle the matter of possession. Louis examined this one through the monocle for a little longer than necessary. That extra second was enough. Halbwachs's fingers touched his collar, in the reflex that would become their shared little dance. The form listed artworks, furnishings, securities, and personal effects in a grand, untidy stream. On the third page, a Renoir appeared under a room number that did not belong to any room Louis had ever known. He said so mildly. Halbwachs frowned and called for another list. The second list placed the same Renoir in a different room altogether. Its talent for migration was already beginning to trouble the authorities. Louis almost seemed sorry for them. Almost. He was shown along a corridor where carpets had been removed for easier cleaning and harder footsteps. The walls were painted a practical shade that had once hoped to be cheerful. Bare bulbs hummed softly overhead. Doors opened and shut at measured intervals. Telephones rang from offices like nervous metal birds. Somewhere nearby, a typewriter kept a brisk rhythm. It sounded less like menace than like a very determined secretary. The room prepared for Louis had a bed, a table, a chair, and a washstand. The sheets were clean enough, though not ironed to Hubert's standards, which were severe and not often met by nations. A blanket sat folded at the foot of the bed. Its wool was rough, but honest. On the washstand stood a basin, a jug of water, and a cake of soap with square corners. The window gave a partial view of a courtyard and one drain pipe. Louis set his hat down on the table. He placed his gloves beside it in a neat pair. He did not fling anything. He did not ask the room to justify itself. That was what unnerved them most at first. He treated captivity as if it were an inferior hotel making a slightly poor impression. Halbwachs arrived again before the room had fully settled around its new occupant. He had more papers. Of course he had more papers. There were signatures required, declarations drafted, and statements concerning assets that ranged from the immense to the absurdly specific. Louis read every page. He did not skim, because skimming would have granted the forms an intimacy they had not earned. When a chair was offered for signing, He took it as though attending a board meeting in an inconvenient annex. His pen moved with careful pressure. The ink dried in a fine blue line. Halbwachs spoke in the tone of a man trying to sound like the state. Louis answered in the tone of a man who had met states before. The difference was educational for both of them. Only one seemed to notice that immediately. By late afternoon, trays began moving through the corridors. One stopped at Louis's door. It held soup, bread, and tea in a cup with a small crack near the handle. The soup was thin, but not offensive. It tasted of potato, leek, and a persuasive amount of salt. A fragment of parsley floated on the surface with lonely optimism. The bread had a tough crust, and a middle that still remembered softness. Louis ate neatly. Hunger is less dramatic when one gives it a spoon and proper timing. Afterward, he folded the napkin in half. Habits built over decades do not vanish because a hotel has changed management. Outside the room, things accelerated in all directions at once. Messages went out by telephone, by cable, by private runner, and by that old family instrument, the urgent telegram. In London, Paris, and New York, relatives discovered that geography does not prevent simultaneous opinion. By evening, the Rothschild telegram chain had begun to resemble the world's first group chat. Like all group chats, it offered contradictory wisdom with enormous confidence. One cable urged immediate compliance, another advised delay, dignity, and no concessions whatsoever. A nephew in New York managed in very few words to recommend accepting and refusing the terms at the same time. Lawyers in dark suits bent over desks under green lamps. Secretaries fed paper into machines and asked for names to be spelled again. At foreign ministries, clerks stamped incoming notes and stacked them in little leaning towers. Ambassadors made inquiries in polished phrases. Bankers sent cautious messages that tried to sound practical and brave in equal measure. At the Metropole switchboard, operators connected calls with swift, tired fingers. The cords crossed and uncrossed like knitting. A woman with a pencil behind one ear heard the name Rothschild so often it briefly ceased to sound like a name. Halbwachs, who had expected detention to be simpler, began receiving calls from men above him, beside him, and inconveniently outside him. Every ring seemed to tighten his collar another fraction. The day was giving him administrative indigestion. He came back to Louis's room near dusk with an expression that tried for authority and landed closer to mild heartburn. There was another paper to consider. There would clearly always be another paper to consider. Louis put up the monocle. He read the new demand in silence. The pause lengthened by a heartbeat. Halbwachs's hand drifted to his throat, as if checking whether his neck remained in place. In that small room, a useful lesson was being taught. Wealth could be taken, property listed, doors locked, and yet composure might remain annoyingly portable. Louis's calm was not theatrical. It was domestic in the deepest sense. He asked practical questions about correspondence, clothing, and whether books could be sent. These were ordinary questions, and that was partly their strength. They refused the room its desired drama. Night came early behind the curtain. The bulb overhead made the basin shine like pale metal. From the corridor came footsteps, voices softened by walls, and the occasional dry cough of an overworked office. Louis washed his hands and face in the basin. The water was cool and held the faint iron taste of old pipes. He brushed his hair before bed because there are limits to what historical upheaval can reasonably demand. The pillow was serviceable. The mattress gave a little in the middle. He lay down in a room that smelled of soap, wool, and building dust. Somewhere in Vienna, the Palais held its roses and its silence. There too the officials had begun moving through reception rooms, counting things, noting things, misunderstanding things. One inventory again misplaced the Renoir. This time it was assigned to a salon that had never contained it for so much as an afternoon. A clerk, far from the painting and far from any art history, copied the room number with total conviction. By now the missing picture had become a private comic opera inside the paperwork. Halbwachs had not yet learned all the verses. Morning entered the Metropole thin and gray. It arrived first at the window, then at the jug, then at the edges of the blanket. A key turned in the lock. Breakfast appeared on a tray with decent punctuality and indifferent coffee. There was bread, butter racked in taper, and a small pot of jam that tasted faintly of apricot and mostly of sugar. The spoon was slightly bent. Louis noticed and used it anyway. He shaved with water from the jug, and a mirror that flattered no one. The soap lathered poorly. Its scent suggested cleanliness understood as policy rather than pleasure. He had just reached the point where the absence of a fresh shirt became a serious philosophical problem. One can bear imprisonment more easily than a wilted collar, especially when Hubert has educated one too thoroughly. At 6 a.m, while the corridor still yawned awake, a murmur moved through the service area downstairs. A porter opened a side door. A figure entered carrying a flat parcel and a look of professional sacrifice. It was Hubert. No one could later explain how he had located the correct entrance so quickly, or why he seemed mildly disappointed by its standards. He wore his ordinary dark suit. He carried with both hands a freshly pressed shirt wrapped in tissue as if delivering state papers. There was also a tie, a folded handkerchief, and shoes polished to the depth of black water. Hubert gave no speech. He simply inclined his head and conveyed through the angle of his ironing that civilization would proceed. A guard asked who had admitted him. Hubert looked at the guard as one might look at a chair asking about lineage. Some barriers yield not to force, but to immaculate household certainty. The metropole had not prepared for that branch of strategy. Word traveled upward in puzzled fragments. The shirt was already halfway to Louis's room. He arrived flustered and slightly pink. He found Louis standing by the washstand while Hubert laid out the collar with sacred precision. For a moment no one spoke. The room contained a prisoner, a valet, an official, and a hierarchy too old and subtle to file correctly. Halbwachs asked how this had been arranged. Hubert answered with silence so polished it nearly reflected light. Louis quite naturally inspected the shirt. The linen had been starched and ironed with loving exactness. The cuffs clicked into place with familiar certainty. The tie came up under the chin and settled where it belonged. Hubert brushed a speck from the sleeve that no one else could see. He straightened the knot half a breath to the left. Then he stepped back with the faint expression of a martyr who has once again rescued standards from public collapse. Halbwachs held a clipboard that now seemed to contain very little help. He tugged his collar. Louis looked at him through the monocle, then at the shirt cuffs, then back again. No insult was spoken, none was required. Something important had become clear in those first hours. Detention had not produced the scene the authorities had ordered for themselves. Instead, they had acquired a man who continued to live by napkins, collars, basin water, and exact reading of forms. Outside the room, the phones kept ringing. Relatives kept cabling from London, Paris, and New York. Governments kept inquiring. Lawyers kept drafting. Clerks kept stamping. Inside the room, Hubert folded the discarded shirt with quiet disapproval and placed it aside for laundering. Then he made a brief inspection of the corridor, the stair turn, and the service route below. He seemed to be mapping the Hotel Metropole in the manner of a military surveyor devoted entirely to clean linen. Louis sat down to breakfast in a fresh shirt while the city shifted around him. The coffee remained poor, the butter was still stingy, yet the collar was perfect. For the Gestapo, this was not the most useful beginning. For Hubert, it was simply Tuesday's work arriving in a new building, and for Louis, sole head of the Austrian banking house, the lesson of the first day had settled quietly into place. The door could lock, the forms could pile up, the monocle would not tremble. Each morning in the Hotel Metropole began with the same pale square of window light. It moved slowly across the wall and reached Louis's chair before it reached his bed. The room smelled of dust, damp wool, and the sharp clean note of carbolic soap. Somewhere beyond the door, a pail touched a stair edge with a dull hollow sound. He woke without fuss and lay still for a moment. Then he sat up, set his feet on the rug, and reached for his dressing gown. The gown was soft at the collar and slightly cooler at the cuffs. Its belt had kept a proper fold, which would have pleased Hubert on principle. The basin water was never truly warm by the time it arrived. Louis still washed carefully, with the brisk economy of a man who disliked waste and disliked slovenliness more. The towel was coarse and thin at the middle from many washings. He dried his hands as though the cloth belonged to a respectable house and not a police hotel. That was one of his quieter gifts. He treated each object according to its proper dignity, even when the object had long given up. A comb waited beside the mirror. His hair was brushed flat and neat, with no concession made to bare bulbs or guard posts. Then came the shirt. It was clean, starched, and impossibly well pressed, as if Vienna itself still employed standards. No one seemed able to explain how Hubert managed this. Shirts appeared with the regularity of sunrise and the mystery of a stage trick. Hubert would enter with an expression of patient suffering that suggested civilization rested on collar points. He laid out linen like a priest arranging altar cloths for a very fussy god. He spoke little. He communicated mostly through ironing and the angle of his eyebrows. The tie was always correct for the day, but there was no social calendar left. Hubert selected sober silk and made the knot with an air of mourning for public life. Louis stood still while cuffs were set and sleeves smoothed. His shoes waited below the chair, polished to an argument. At 6 a.m, through a service entrance, under occupation, polished shoes still arrived. Hubert's devotion had become its own quiet form of weather. Breakfast came on a tray with thin coffee, bread, butter, and sometimes a boiled egg. The coffee smelled promising and tasted resigned, which was often the way of institutional coffee. Louis ate neatly and left crumbs gathered, not scattered. He folded the napkin once and placed it to one side. A spoon rang against the cup in the corridor. Doors opened and closed with careful caution, as if everyone had agreed to keep noise modest. Books occupied the greater part of the morning. They stood in little stacks on the table, by the bed, and once on the washstand. He read history, memoir, business papers, and a little poetry when the day felt dusty. He turned pages with his usual exactness and never bent a corner. A pencil rested beside each volume. He made small notes in the margin only when the book was his. That rule survived captivity along with many others. Standards like houseplants did better when tended every day. The old reception rooms of the Palais Rothschild felt very far away then. Yet sometimes the smell of leather from a binding opened a small door in the mind. He could almost place the library there again. Good tobacco lingered in the curtains, and hothouse roses stood heavy in silver bowls. The Metropole offered different flowers. Its bouquet was soap, ink, boiled cabbage, and corridor paint. By late morning, he turned to correspondence. That work required patience, sharp eyes, and a willingness to be interrupted by history's least graceful paperwork. Paper arrived in uneven qualities and uncertain amounts. Some sheets were thick and creamy, while others felt like dry bread under the fingers. Envelopes were precious. Pencil stubs were hoarded, down to a scandalously short length. He wrote with a firm hand and a measured pace. The nib scratched, paused, and scratched again in the small room. Some letters were practical and some were affectionate. Most had to be both at once, which is a tiring way for a sentence to earn its living. He asked after health and weather. He inquired about funds, property, signatures, permits, and the movement of people across borders. The censors would read what they pleased. Louis therefore wrote as if addressing clerks with literary ambitions and relatives with weak nerves. He chose words that were plain enough for officials and warm enough for family. It was a narrow bridge, and he crossed it daily. Reply sheets came back late and often half useful. Dates wandered, names were misspelled, and important facts lived in the corners. Even so, the act of writing gave shape to the day. An hour could be folded into paragraphs and tied with string. Around noon, a tray might bring soup. It was usually pale and patient, with barley, onion, and a few tired carrots. On good days there was parsley floating on top. On ordinary days there was a potato conducting quiet business at the bottom. Louis ate slowly and without complaint. Complaining to soup would have been beneath him, and in fairness, beneath the soup. After lunch the corridor settled into its own rhythm. A typewriter tapped somewhere below, brisk as rain against a window ledge. Boots passed in groups, and then not at all. A door latch clicked, and then the building returned to its habitual throat-clearing. Other detainees learned his routine by those sounds. They began to measure the day by the arrival of trays and forms at his door. Staff learned it too. A chambermaid once remarked that the Baron thanked people as they dining at the Palais. She did not mean it ironically. She meant that the thanks were calm, direct, and perfectly timed. The tale spread in the hotel the way such tales do. It traveled with mop buckets, cigarette breaks, and whispers over ledgers. There was a prisoner upstairs, people said, who still wore proper cuffs. There was a man who examined orders as if judging wine. By the middle of that year, Commissar Halbwachs had become part of the furniture. He arrived so often that his knock acquired a weary family note. He always carried papers. Some were clipped, some tied, and some clutched like moral support. Halbwachs smelled of damp wool, office dust, and hurried tobacco. He entered with the face of a man already losing an argument to the afternoon. Louis would rise, or inclined his head if seated, and wait. Courtesy cost little and unsettled the commissar every single time. Then the forms came out. There were declarations, inventories, statements, attestations, and supplementary attestations for the forms that had grown lonely. The Anschluss had been history's most catastrophic merger. No shareholder vote was held, and the paperwork still somehow multiplied. Halbwachs would explain a new requirement in an official tone. He sounded like a clerk reading weather to the sea. Louis listened without hurry. Then he raised the monocle. It went up with the same movement every time. The glass settled in place, and the room seemed to wait with it. He read each page line by line. His silence was contemplative and faintly sorrowful, as if the document had not quite lived up to its own promise. That, more than any direct objection, undid Halbwachs. The commissary prepared for pleading, anger, or collapse, but not disappointed connoisseurship. Questions followed, always simple and fatally specific. Which ministry had signed this version, and why did yesterday's valuation differ by several inconvenient zeros? Had the export restriction been amended again, or merely retyped? Was item 19 a table, a desk, or a philosophical misunderstanding? Halbwachs would tug at his collar and consult another sheet. His confidence then left the room in small, visible stages. There were reasons these negotiations dragged. Large theft, it turned out, still required quite a lot of paper to look respectable. The Austrian banking house was not a single locked cash box. It was a web of holdings, claims, accounts, land, securities, art, and obligations. Some assets sat in Vienna and some did not. Some were in names that belonged to individuals, and some belonged to companies with patient lawyers. The state wanted money, foreign currency, and public submission. Different offices wanted those things in different orders and with different stamps. One desk demanded a tax settlement before any permit moved. Another demanded proof of emigration before the tax could even be calculated. A third office wanted a valuation of paintings that another office had already confiscated. Modern terms would call this a hostile takeover without an appointment. Nothing could be sold neatly because everyone wished to seize first and count later. Even theft preferred a filing system. Foreign exchange rules tangled with exit papers tangled with family trusts, and family trusts tangled with governments in other countries. Each step needed signatures from men who disliked sharing authority. Each man then guarded his signature like a dragon sitting on a stamp pad. Halbwachs understood only part of this machinery. The rest hummed above him in Berlin, in ministries, and in rival offices across Vienna. He therefore returned to Louis again and again. The prisoner knew how the structure fit together, which was unhelpful for the captors. Louis explained only what needed explaining. He did so with the calm of a banker discussing weather damage to a roof. He did not speed the process by losing his head. There was no evidence that anyone else's head would have improved matters either. In the afternoons, telegrams began to arrive. They came folded into urgency and handed over with the ceremonious dread of tiny bombs. The telegram chain had become the family's first group chat. Like all group chats, everyone was wrong in a slightly different direction. One message from London urged immediate acceptance of terms. Another from Paris advised delay, discretion, and under no circumstances any appearance of eagerness. New York managed to improve on this confusion. A nephew sent 3 telegrams in one afternoon and contradicted himself with admirable efficiency. One cable said, accept if safe. Another said, refuse if pressured. And the third recommended accepting only by refusing first. Louis read them all at the table by the window. He smoothed each flimsy sheet flat with one finger. The paper had its own dry little sound. It crackled like leaves that had heard too much. He stacked the telegrams by city, then by usefulness, which produced a much smaller pile. Family affection remained abundant, while practical agreement remained almost a myth. Cousin Anthony favored settlement before worse terms arrived. Uncle Robert preferred principle, distance, and capital letters. Someone in Paris requested information already supplied twice. Someone in London asked for calm while sending 3 urgent underlined questions. Louis answered as he read, or marked points for later reply. His pencil moved with a steady patience that the cables themselves did not deserve. He did not mock the family for worrying. He merely seemed to view their alarm as another weather pattern passing over the Atlantic. Halbwachs hated arriving during telegram hour. He would find Louis behind a little barricade of family advice and lose whatever footing he had brought. The commissar once stood waiting while Louis finished reading a table from New York. The monocle remained in place throughout, which was cruel in the gentlest possible way. On that afternoon, the papers concerned household inventories. The list included silver, carpets, furniture, books, and the now migratory Renoir. By then, the missing Renoir had already lived several paper lives. It had appeared first in a salon, then a morning room, then somewhere called the Blue Sitting Room. The Palais contained many rooms, but not that exact room in any usable sense. It sounded like a place invented by a man facing deadlines. Halbwachs produced the latest inventory with defensive firmness. The Renoir now apparently hung in a small gallery near a staircase no one could identify. Louis examined the line through the monocle and paused. Halbwachs's left eye gave a short, involuntary flutter that would become a habit. Louis asked which staircase was meant. He then asked whether the previous staircase had been retired from service. No one in the metropole could answer this. The Renoir had become less a painting than a traveling clerical event. Still, the room around Louis remained ordinary in its needs. A cup needed emptying, and a sock required mending near the heel. Hubert saw to such matters with immense private drama. He repaired a loose button, as if restitching the fabric of Europe, one tiny loop at a time. The seasons changed outside without consulting anyone inside. Summer thinned into autumn, and the window frame grew cooler to the touch. At dusk, the glass reflected the room before it reflected the street. Louis sometimes saw himself there, a dark jacket, a pale hand, a single glint of lens. Supper was usually more substantial than lunch and less memorable. Potatoes reappeared in reliable company with cabbage, gravy, or a slice of boiled meat. Bread hardened quickly on the tray, so he wrapped half for later. A small apple, when available, felt almost festive. He kept his room orderly after the meal. A plate moved here, a book returned there, a letter weighed down by an ink bottle. Such habits were not empty. Order made a frame around the day and kept shapelessness outside the door. In the evenings he read again, often under poorer light than any serious reader deserved. The bare bulb flattened colors and made every page look more official than literature should. Even so, books still did their work. They opened windows without permits and crossed borders without a passport. Sometimes there were murmurs from other rooms. Sometimes a man coughed for a long while and then stopped. Sometimes a guard laughed downstairs with more volume than wit. The sound drifted upward and softened before it reached Louis's door. He was known by then among staff and detainees alike. Not everyone knew his face, but most knew the outline of his composure. A kitchen woman had heard that he folded his blanket each morning. A clerk had noticed that he always capped his pen before answering a question. Another prisoner had been told that the Baron still changed for the evening. This last detail acquired the status of minor legend. There was comfort in legend when circumstances were thin. It suggested the world still contained shape, ritual, and the right tie after dusk. From time to time, Louis exchanged a few words with those allowed near him. The subjects were modest and therefore useful. He asked a cleaner about her son's apprenticeship. He remarked to a porter that the weather had finally chosen a season. These were not grand gestures. They were simple acts of keeping human scale inside a machine built for the opposite. The result was a reputation that spread quietly and stuck. He was, people said, the composed prisoner. Some admired the courage in that. Others simply liked the relief of encountering a person who did not add panic to the building. Halbwachs found this especially irritating because he could not forbid it. Composure left no paper trail and required no permit. By winter, the commissar's visits had taken on a nearly domestic regularity. He arrived after lunch on Tuesdays often enough to feel scheduled by fate. Louis would be seated with a book or correspondence. The chair opposite remained empty until Halbwachs filled it with paperwork and unease. The forms thickened with the cold. There were new declarations on assets abroad and fresh demands for detailed valuations. Some papers asked for numbers already supplied in spring. Others wanted the same answer under a slightly different heading, which is one way bureaucracy keeps warm. Louis continued to read every line. His monocle never trembled, and Halbwachs's collar suffered accordingly. Once the commissar attempted brisk authority and spoke for several uninterrupted minutes. At the end, Louis asked whether page 3 canceled page 2. It did, in fact, cancel page 2. Halbwachs then had to leave with both pages, his jaw set in administrative sorrow. The negotiations dragged because confiscation was simple and release was complicated. Money had to be extracted, permissions staged, and appearances managed. The regime wanted a lesson and a profit. It also wanted foreign currency, legal camouflage, and time for every office to claim a share. Relatives abroad had funds but not one voice. Governments abroad had opinions but not direct control. The Austrian house had roots in a century of agreements, partnerships, and obligations. Uprooting such a thing with forms alone took many seasons. Louis understood that delay was not always accident. Delay could also be method, pressure, theater, and fee collection wearing a serious tie. Yet delay also trapped the state in its own maze. Each extra paper created one more chance for contradiction to wander in. The telegram chain noticed none of this in any orderly way. It only grew louder, more affectionate, and less synchronized. A cable from London requested caution and speed in the same sentence. Paris wanted dignity, secrecy, and immediate clarity from everyone else. New York continued its heroic campaign against internal consistency. One message read like a stock tip from a nervous ant. Louis received these with the same steady face he gave government demands. Family panic and official pressure both met the monocle and sat down a little straighter. When a telegram arrived during breakfast, he placed it beside the marmalade until the tray was cleared. There was no need to let urgency butter the bread. Hubert approved of this hierarchy. Linen first, then civilization, then panic. The valet's impossible appearances continued through winter and into spring. Fresh callers emerged from the metropole's back passages like diplomatic miracles. At least once he materialized near dawn with a brushed coat over one arm. His expression suggested the real emergency had been the state of the cuffs. Even Halbwachs seemed unsettled by Hubert. It is difficult to dominate a room when a valet is silently judging your pressing. As months passed, Louis's captivity settled into that strange thing called routine. It was not comfort, but it had edges and could therefore be handled. He knew when the soup came and when the light failed. He knew which guard coughed on the landing and which clerk favored cheap violet ink. He knew the texture of the blanket in dry weather and in damp weather. He knew how long an envelope took to cross 3 borders and return with one useful sentence. That knowledge was plain and domestic. It was also a way of refusing to dissolve. The metropole itself had changed from shocking to familiar without becoming less ugly. Bare bulbs remained bare bulbs, even after one had learned their moods. The old leather and tobacco of the Palais belonged to another world. Here the smell of soap, paper, and wet coats ruled the day. Still, memory came and went in gentle draughts, a silver frame in his mind, a rose-house warmth, a long polished floor. Then the corridor would sound again, a tray would scrape, or a latch would lift and the present would politely return. By the end of that captive year, the staff no longer stared at his composure. They expected it in the way one expects the stair rail to be cold. Other detainees borrowed steadiness from the idea of him. It helped to know that someone upstairs still folded letters square. Halbwachs, meanwhile, had developed the look of a man pursued by his own files. The missing Renoir continued to migrate through inventories like a seasonal bird. When it appeared for the 3rd time in a room nobody could place, Louis only lifted the monocle. Halbwachs pinched the bridge of his nose and made a note destined to confuse another week. So the months moved on through paper, trays, books, and polished shoes. The negotiations stretched toward 14 months because greed was large and administration was slow. Louis met that long stretch as he met each morning. He washed, dressed, read, answered, examined, and waited, without surrendering the small forms of order. It was not a dramatic life then. It was a life of collars, soup, penciled notes, and one unshaken lens. And that was precisely why it endured. In the Hotel Metropole, amid bare bulbs and forms, ordinary dignity became its own patient clock. The morning light reached Louis only after it had crossed 2 courtyards and a corridor of bare bulbs. By then it looked thin and official, like paper that had already been stamped by 3 departments. He was already dressed. because captivity had not persuaded him to breakfast in disarray. His collar sat clean against his neck. His cuffs showed a narrow white edge. His tie held the sort of patient knot that suggested Hubert had recently passed through a wall. The room smelled of carbolic soap, cooling tea, and the old leather of a suitcase that no one had properly unpacked. A tray stood on the small table beside the window. There was weak coffee in a metal pot. There were 2 rolls with a hard shine on top. There was butter cut into strict rectangles, as if even dairy had become administrative. Louis broke a roll with slow care and listened to footsteps outside. He could tell the guards apart now by their rhythm. One dragged his heels near the turn of the corridor. One cleared his throat before every doorway, like a man rehearsing a very minor part. When Commissar Halbwachs arrived, he carried a folder with both hands and a face that wished to be firm. The folder was thick enough to suggest bad news, though lately they all were. His hair lay flat with too much water. His collar already looked defeated, and it was not yet 9. Louis rose by a measured inch and inclined his head. Halbwachs laid the folder on the table and smoothed the cover twice. Then he produced his fountain pen, a handkerchief, and finally the paper itself, like a conjurer specializing in forms. The new demand was typed on pale stock, with a crooked left margin. It was not vague this time. It was not wrapped in broad phrases about state necessity or public order. It named the Vitkavis Iron and Steel Works. For a moment the room became very quiet, though the corridor still held the faint tapping of a typewriter. Louis lifted his monocle and settled it into place. He read the line once. He read it again. Halbwachs waited with the posture of a man who had delivered a piano up 3 flights of stairs. Vitkavis was not a villa, nor a neat row of bonds, nor a few pictures eased from a wall. It was furnaces and coke ovens and rail sidings, stretching through the Moravian plain. It was smoke, shift whistles, ore wagons, and the steady red glow of metal doing what governments always wanted it to do. Louis knew those works in the way a banker knows a distant machine through papers and visits. He knew the smell of hot oil near the rolling mills. He knew the black dust that settled on windowsills by noon. He knew the long office tables where clerks sharpened pencils before the first numbers arrived. Vitkavis had its own clocks and its own weather. The chimneys made one kind of sky. The wagons made another kind of thunder, though today he remembered them gently from a safe interior distance. Steel on that scale was not merely a business. It was rails for trains, and plate for ships, and wire for miles of fence. It was beams for stations and bridges and warehouses. It was the strong, useful skeleton hidden inside a great many ordinary things. The paper in Halbwachs's hand tried to make all that look tidy. It reduced furnaces to lines and ownership to boxes waiting for signatures. In modern terms, the Gestapo had attempted Europe's most aggressive hostile takeover without even making an appointment. Louis took another sip of coffee before answering. The coffee had gone lukewarm. That made his pause seem even longer. Halbwachs watched the monocle more than the man behind it. The monocle never rushed. It regarded the typed demand with the faint sorrow of a diner considering soup that had clearly been oversalted by the state. At last Louis set the paper down with one finger. He asked for clarification on one legal point, then another, then a third. Each question required Halbwachs to consult the second sheet. The second sheet was worse. It named not only Vitkavis, but the Vienna banking house as well. It reached toward properties, securities, and art, with the confidence of a diner who had mistaken the sideboard for a menu. The Austrian house had sat for generations within ledgers, letters, habits, and rooms. Its wealth was not just money. It was desks worn smooth by cuffs and elbows. It was seals pressed into wax. It was names written in the same hand across 40 years of patient mornings. Louis could picture the bank on an ordinary day. A porter brushed the front step before 8. Clerks opened the tall windows a little, then complained about the draft. Ink bottles stood beside blotting paper, and telephones waited like black, polished insects. In the Palais on Prince Eugenstrasse, the roses were probably still being changed on schedule. Someone would have trimmed the stems in the pantry sink. Someone would have shaken the crumbs from a damask cloth into the garden, out of perfectly useless loyalty to order. That house had once held hothouse roses and good tobacco, and the low shine of old leather. Now its rooms were passing into lists. Its shelves became inventory. Its carpets became measurable surfaces. Its air itself seemed available for confiscation, if only a clerk could find the right form. Halbwachs turned a page and named paintings. He named silver. He named country properties, city houses, and the broad portfolio that had grown over a century and a half. It was a collection of assets, certainly. It was also the furniture of a family memory. There were vineyards whose walls had been mended after spring rain. There were hunting lodges with too many umbrellas in the hall stand. There were townhouses where spare keys slept in little china bowls. The demands reached across them all with astonishing appetite. One line concerned a Renoir. Louis listened as Halbwachs gave the room number with grave certainty. The missing Renoir, meanwhile, had apparently moved again, like a houseguest refusing to settle in any assigned bedroom. Louis raised the monocle and asked whether this was not the third location already proposed. Halbwachs checked his notes. A small twitch appeared near his left eye, then behaved as if it had always been there. The inventory had become its own small comedy of errors. A side table was listed twice under two spellings. A set of Sèvres cups had gained an extra saucer in translation. The Renoir had now occupied a salon, a corridor, and what sounded suspiciously like a cloakroom. Louis did not smile. He merely waited. That was far more damaging. Halbwachs cleared his throat and returned to the main matter. Vidkovits mattered because steel mattered. That point did not require much imagination in 1938, and certainly not much cynicism. Every state in Europe counted steel in tons and train timetables and endless memoranda. A steelworks of that size meant power long before anyone spoke the word aloud. The complex had blast furnaces taller than houses. It had workshops with overhead cranes that moved like patient metal herons. It had sidings where wagons lined up nose to tail, carrying coal, ore, limestone, and all the ingredients of industrial bread. Nothing about it was dainty. Nothing about it could be hidden in a pocket. Yet there it sat on paper, waiting for a signature, one line beneath the family name. Louis leaned back and folded his hands. The chair gave a small wooden sigh. Outside, a cart crossed the street and rattled over stones, sounding absurdly domestic against such numbers. He had visited industrial plants enough times to remember their small details best. He remembered enamel mugs near drafting tables. He remembered coat hooks loaded with caps. He remembered the way men wiped soot from their faces and somehow left a pale line beside each eye. The clerks in Vienna would understand the scale immediately. The relatives in London and New York would understand it too, though through telegram codes and bank cables. Vidkovits was one of those enterprises that lived in the family mind like a weather map. Even children heard the name in dining rooms. Even elderly aunts knew it involved smoke, rails, and astonishing amounts of money. The Nazi paper had finally stopped circling and landed. It asked for a thing so vast that argument itself seemed to shrink in the room. The old bargaining stage had ended. Now the arithmetic would begin. Arithmetic, in families like this, arrived wrapped in couriers, cables, and poor handwriting. By noon, messages were moving across Vienna towards Swiss and Dutch intermediaries. By evening, London had heard enough to be alarmed in 4 different styles. By the next day, New York joined with its own special talent for fast and conflicting urgency. The Rothschild telegram chain was, as ever, the world's first group chat. Like all group chats, it offered 5 directions at once, and complete confidence in every one of them. Cousin Anthony urged acceptance in clean, firm phrases. Uncle Robert sent under no circumstances, in a manner that suggested larger capitals were still being invented. A nephew in New York somehow recommended yielding and refusing within the space of 17 words. In London, the papers spread across a table under a shaded lamp. The room smelled faintly of coal fire and sealing wax. A silver tray held cups gone cold before anyone drank them. The household clock struck the quartered hours with unnecessary dignity. Men in dark suits arrived by side doors and left through another. They carried leather cases with cracked handles. Their umbrellas leaned in a stand by the hall, each one shining damply from a mean little rain. Voices stayed low, because low voices always feel more expensive. No one wanted direct dealing with Berlin officials if it could be avoided. So the work passed through bankers, lawyers, and trusted intermediaries in neutral cities. Zurich received one stream of inquiry. Geneva received another. The Hague listened politely, took notes, and sent the notes onward in careful envelopes. There were lunches that no one tasted, and meetings that began with weather and ended in property law. There were hotel lounges where men stirred untouched coffee while discussing ownership of half a continent. There were calls placed through operators who sounded bored, which was a blessing. Bored operators are often the final guardians of civilization. In New York, the day began later and louder. Secretaries tore cable envelopes cleanly along the top and stacked them by urgency. Taxi horns floated up from the street, reminding everyone that commerce, unlike dynastic panic, kept normal business hours. The American relatives looked at the figures and felt the scale in a different way. Steelworks, bank, houses, pictures, securities, land. The list had the chill completeness of a cupboard emptied, shelf by shelf. One advisor wanted categories, another wanted replacement values, a third wanted to know whether sentiment should appear on the page at all. Sentiment did not enter the columns, though it hovered very close. The family knew the story of its money as something built slowly. Branches had spread across cities. Capital had moved from railways to mines to banks to all the other durable parts of Europe. Fortunes that looked immense from outside had been made from habits of attention inside. Someone checked the coal contracts. Someone reread a partnership deed from years earlier. Someone remembered which estates still had tenant accounts recorded in brown leather books. Generations had added to the pile in ways both grand and painfully ordinary. A railway concession here, a shrewd bond there, a factory, a forest, a vineyard, a block of city property, then another. Now one man's freedom sat on the opposite side of that long accumulation. The question sounded simple and impossible. What is a life worth in steel and deeds and rooms full of paintings? No one liked saying it plainly. So they spoke in percentages, jurisdictions, and legal obstacles. That is how wealthy families often survive hard truths. They dress feeling in office clothes and hope it passes inspection. Louis, meanwhile, spent that afternoon walking the length of his room and back. 12 paces took him from window to washstand. 12 paces returned him to the table. He kept the document folded once in the middle, precisely, as if neatness might improve its character. A fresh shirt appeared near dusk. No one admitted how it arrived. Hubert seemed to emerge from the service entrance at 6 a.m, at dusk, and probably between the walls at midnight. He laid the shirt out on the chair with the face of a saint burdened by lesser mortals. The shirt itself was perfect. Its front held the faint starch crackle that promised moral order. Its collar points were so exact that even Halbwachs noticed them and disliked what he felt. When Halbwachs returned, he brought another page of additions. There were country houses. There were urban properties under several companies. There were contents of safes and selected art objects, as though culture had become a pantry to be inventoried. Louis listened without changing posture. He asked whether the Vienna banking house itself was to be surrendered as an institution or only as premises. Halbwachs blinked twice. That question required a memorandum. He did not enjoy memoranda after 5 o'clock. The list of artworks lengthened by the day. Portraits, landscapes, bronzes, tapestries, porcelain, silver. Each item entered the file stripped of color and mood and the way light had once found it. Art in an inventory becomes oddly humble. A painting that had presided over dinners for 40 years turns into measurements, title, school, and condition. Even grandeur eventually lies still under carbon copies. Some of the works had family stories attached. A grandmother had chosen one after an argument in Paris. An uncle had overpaid for another and spent decades defending the decision at lunch. A little panel had once hung beside a staircase where children brushed it with their sleeves. The papers did not ask for stories. They asked for transfer. Yet stories clung to the edges of everything. In London, a cousin unfolded an estate map and remembered the smell of wet leaves on that drive. In New York, another relative touched a telegram and pictured the library at the Palais. He remembered dark shelves and the dust that rises only when afternoon sun enters at the right angle. The reckoning was not only moral or financial, it was domestic. It asked what could be let go when letting go meant rooms, trees, office ledgers, and the very shape of a past. Some argued that no sum should be paid to men who behaved like burglars with clipboards. The point was sound. It also left Louis in the Hotel Metropole. Other voices answered that principle is cold company in a locked room. That point was sound as well. It is irritating when history presents two sound points and waits with crossed arms. Messages crossed one another through neutral capitals. A banker in Zurich requested confirmation of title on one property and correction on another. A lawyer in Geneva wanted authority to speak for all branches together, which was almost comic. Gathering the family into one opinion was like arranging deck chairs during a windstorm, only with better tailoring. Even the wording of surrender mattered. Was this sale, transfer, forfeiture, settlement, or ransom dressed in a lawyer's collar? The terms shifted with each draft. Everyone understood the truth regardless. This was a price for one man, demanded in the language of acquisition. The Anschluss had been history's most catastrophic merger. No shareholder vote had been held. No due diligence had been conducted. Now the bill was arriving with remarkable confidence, and very little paperwork fit for the amount. In Vienna, Louis asked for updated copies of the inventories before dinner. He liked to see how greed organized itself. The copies came with smudged carbons and a fresh error in the numbering. The missing Renoir had migrated again, this time to a morning room no one had used for years. Louis touched the page with one finger and said nothing. Silence, in the right hands, can be more educational than a lecture. Halbwachs tugged his collar, looked at the date, and made a note to investigate. The eye twitch returned, punctual as a tram. The family circles abroad began, slowly, to narrow their differences, not because agreement felt good, because the alternatives had all been examined and found to taste of ash. A life could not be entered in a ledger, but everything else could. So they entered everything else. Secretaries prepared summaries in neat columns. Council compared values and jurisdictions. One set of figures covered the bank and associated assets. Another covered properties and artworks. Wittgeweiss stood on the page, like a black factory silhouette against pale paper. No one mistook its weight. It was among Europe's great industrial complexes. Its furnaces and mills would matter enormously to any regime that measured power in output and steel. The demand for it was not random. It was direct, strategic, and coldly sensible in the worst possible way. That harsh sense made the family decision harder, not easier. Petty theft can be dismissed with anger. Grand theft, when wrapped in state forms and legal phrases, asks to be argued with. There is always a temptation to believe a better memorandum will save the day. Many memoranda were tried. They produced only more memoranda. By late evening in London, the lamp on the table had burned a warm circle into the room. Ashtrays held long, soft towers of gray. Tea had been replaced by whiskey for some, and by more tea for the truly determined. A plate of biscuits sat untouched except for one broken half. The talk turned plain at last. If they refused, Louis remained where he was. If they accepted, whole branches of the family's European substance would be torn away. There was no version in which anyone kept both the man and the inheritance entire. That was the real price. Not simply money, not even simply property. It was continuity. It was the long line of care by which one generation hands useful things to the next. A signature now would break that line on purpose, and for a reason all could understand. Some found that understanding unbearable. Others found it clarifying. What good was a dynasty after all, if it could not spend itself on its own living blood? That sentence, once said aloud, remained in the room and changed the air. The decision did not become easy. It became possible. New York answered after another round of cables. There was reluctance, anger, disbelief. Then acceptance of the arithmetic no one had wanted. The language softened around the edges. Practical steps replaced moral rehearsal. Documents needed drafting. Intermediaries needed authority. Valuations needed not to delay what delay could no longer improve. In neutral offices, pens scratched over heavy paper. Dates were inserted. Powers were assigned. Bankers who had spent years arranging loans and placements now helped arrange a family self-amputation, with polished shoes and excellent discretion. The legal shape of the surrender took form piece by piece. Wittgeweiss would go. The Vienna banking house would go. Artworks, properties, and a broad spread of assets would pass with them, each item carrying a small invisible echo. No one celebrated clarity. Yet clarity has a certain tired comfort after weeks of fog. Louis received hints of progress before he received the whole. Halbwachs became less blustery and more intent. The guards outside his room took on the look of men awaiting instructions from a higher shelf. The papers arriving each day were now less exploratory and more exact. That was its own answer. He spent one afternoon cleaning the rim of his monocle with a linen square. The gesture took almost no time and somehow occupied several minutes. Then he put the square away and asked for writing paper, though he wrote only a few lines. He knew what the family was weighing. He knew what Wittgeweiz meant. He knew what the Vienna house meant, and what the old rooms meant, and what the paintings meant. Being calm did not mean being blind. It meant looking directly and not flinching for the benefit of other people. When the formal agreement was at last reached abroad, it came not with triumph but with exhaustion. A final cluster of cables confirmed consent among the necessary branches. Lawyers compared language one last time. Bankers nodded, corrected 2 dates, and initialed margins with the grave wariness of men signing away weather. The family had agreed to pay the price. That sentence sounds simple when it is finished. It was not simple in the making. It had cost long tables of figures, bitter silences, and the private knowledge that generations of work were being handed over under duress. In London, one relative folded the last cable and rubbed the bridge of his nose. In New York, another finally drank the cold coffee beside his elbow. Somewhere in Geneva, a clerk sanded wet ink and stacked the papers square. These were the small household gestures that accompany enormous decisions. A family fortune is often imagined as a glittering abstraction. In truth, it also lives in filing cabinets, map drawers, account books, and keys labeled in fading ink. To surrender it is to give up not only value, but habit. Names, once printed on letterhead, no longer belong there. The cost also had a shape no paper could hold. The Austrian branch would not simply lose possessions, it would lose its settled place in the life of Vienna. Palais, office, collections, staff routines, gardens, and daily authority would all pass into memory together. For a family built by continuity, that wound mattered deeply. The decision crossed the continent and returned to Louis through official channels, because unofficial kindness was not the style of the building. Halbwachs entered with 2 folders this time in an expression almost respectful, though he hated that in himself. He placed the papers down and explained the terms. His voice kept snagging on the legal phrasing. Louis listened in stillness. Wittgeweiz, the Vienna Bank, properties, art, a broad portfolio representing 150 years of patient accumulation. All of it weighed against one man's release. He looked through the monocle for a very long moment. Halbwachs shifted his feet and tugged his collar once more. The bare bulb above them gave a low hum, like an office too tired to continue its own opinions. Louis asked for one clause to be read again. Then he nodded. No flourish attended the moment. No speech came. He simply accepted the fact of what his relatives had done and what it had cost them. That calm acceptance may have been the last thing Halbwachs wanted. Drama would have suited the room better. Drama would have made everyone feel less absurd. Instead, there was only a very composed man, a stack of papers, and the faint smell of soap from the corridor. After Halbwachs left, the room felt both larger and emptier. Louis sat by the small table and looked at the untouched evening tray. There was clear soup, with sliced carrot and a few pale noodles. There was boiled beef, gone gray at the edges. There was stewed fruit, sweet enough to suggest optimism in the kitchen. He ate a little of the soup. He left the beef. He finished the fruit. Ordinary appetite, even in such hours, remains one of the strangest comforts. A life may have just been priced in steelworks and picture frames. Still, the spoon must find the bowl, and the napkin must return to the lap. Near dawn, as if summoned by the conclusion of European finance itself, Hubert appeared at the service entrance. He carried a fresh collar, a brushed coat, and the deep resignation of a man betrayed by history's effect on linen. He set the shoes beneath the chair and inspected the cuffs laid out for mourning. The angle of his ironing conveyed that empires might crumble, but creases would not. Louis thanked him with the slightest turn of his head. Hubert absorbed this as one accepts tribute properly owed. Outside, the corridor remained harsh and plain under its bulbs. Inside, the shirt waited immaculate on the chair back. That was what the family had bought, among other things. Not only freedom in the abstract, also the chance for another morning to begin with clean linen, polished shoes, and a man still himself. The first folder arrives before breakfast, with its corners already soft from too many official hands. The paper smells of dust, carbon ink, and the faint starch of a clerk's cuff. The room at the Hotel Metropole smells of carbolic soap and damp wool. Bare bulbs have no talent for flattery. Louis sits at the table with the same straight back he once brought to dinner at the Palais. A guard stands near the door like a coat stand with opinions. Commissar Halbwach sets down 3 tied bundles and 1 loose sheet he clearly wishes were not loose. The page on top concerns Witkowitz, which cannot be handed over like a silver tray or a well-bred Labrador. It arrives in parts, with schedules, appendices, and a supplementary schedule to correct the first schedule. Even Halbwach looks briefly as if he has seen the sea. The steelworks exist on paper as columns of names and numbers. Blast furnaces become line items. Rolling mills become subclauses. Rail sidings, machine shops, coke ovens, warehouses, company houses, and spare bolts all patiently wait for their place in the Reich's filing system. Every page needs a date in the top corner. Every date needs initials in blue pencil. Every signature needs a witness, a stamp, and sometimes another stamp to show that the first stamp was properly stamped. Carbon sheets leave a ghostly blue on the fingertips. The typists change ribbons twice in 1 week. The carriage bells on their machines ring with the small, sad note of trams heard in fog. Louis reads the first transfer deed through his monocle. He holds the page a little farther from the lamp. He gives it the faintly sorrowful look of a connoisseur asked to approve a wine that has not quite made the grade. Halbwach waits with his hands clasped behind his back. After a long, quiet moment, he clears his throat. Then he remembers who has not spoken, and he clears it again more softly. The legal path is exact, which is almost comforting in its own dreary way. Share certificates must be endorsed. Board powers must be reassigned. Registries in Vienna and Moravia must show new names in the proper boxes. There are papers for the parent company. There are papers for linked companies with names half the length of a railway platform. There are papers for mines, transport subsidiaries, insurers, and a small forest that seems to have wandered into the file by mistake. One annex lists furnaces by number. Another lists locomotives with their year of manufacture. Another notes who owns a row of brick cottages near a works gate and who pays to mend the roofs. Nothing in the right can simply be taken without at least pretending to be organized about it. In modern terms, the Gestapo has attempted Europe's most aggressive hostile takeover of a family office without making an appointment. The paperwork is their apology note. By the second morning, the table has acquired its own geography. Deeds lie to the left, valuation forms lie to the right. A small hill of corrected pages rises near the inkstand, like a paper version of the Alps, only flatter and less useful. Breakfast arrives on a tray with a chipped cup and 2 slices of bread. The coffee substitute tastes faintly of roasted patience. Louis eats slowly and signs nothing while the bread is still warm. At 6, Hubert appears at the service entrance as if summoned by the distress of a caller somewhere in the city. He carries a fresh shirt and tissue paper. He also carries a tie already rolled into the precise shape of obedience. No one can explain how Hubert gets past the guards. No one seems willing to ask, which is wise. He says almost nothing, but his ironing speaks with a grave professional authority. He lays out the shirt with the care of a man preparing a diplomatic settlement of cuffs. The collar points are exact. The studs are cool as coins. His expression suggests that historical collapse is no excuse for a wrinkled sleeve. By noon, Witkowitz has multiplied into more papers than any mill ever deserved. The transfer needs authorizations from absent boards, notices to courts, revised articles, and certified copies of older certified copies. The older copies smell faintly of old glue and cabinet wood. A clerk brings in sealing wax and a brass stamp. The wax pools red on the folded flap and hardens with a satin sheen. The stamp leaves an eagle on the page, neat and final and oddly domestic. Louis signs where he must sign. The nib scratches with a dry, steady whisper. Halbwach places blotting paper over each signature as if tucking in a difficult child. He checks dates, page numbers, and witness lines. He discovers a missing initial on page 14 and looks personally betrayed by page 14. The stated values move through the file in tidy figures. Coal reserves become currency. Steel output becomes currency. Whole years of labor, soot, whistles, canteens, pay envelopes, and shift clocks become currency too. On one sheet, the number runs so long it seems to need a rest halfway across the page. The paper reduces an industrial empire to Reichsmarks with excellent margins. It is a trick of office work that never stops being strange. A telegram arrives during the afternoon, then another, then one more, which has crossed paths with the others and contradicts them all with admirable efficiency. Uncle Robert cables under no circumstances. A nephew in New York sends 3 messages in one afternoon and somehow recommends accepting and refusing at the same time. The Rothschild telegram chain is essentially the world's first group chat. Like all group chats, it produces urgency, contradiction, and absolutely no reduction in paperwork. Halbwachs reads none of it, but he senses its weather. The next bundle concerns the bank in Vienna. Its pages have a different smell. They carry the odor of old leather ledgers, drawer-lining paper, and the polish once used on counters where clerks bowed to regular depositors. For 130 years, the bank has stood in the city with its name on the plate and its habits in place. Now the closing takes the form of forms. The end of an era arrives as a set of instructions in duplicate. Accounts are listed, balanced, frozen, or transferred. Cash reserves are counted to the last neat figure. Securities are described by number, drawer, and packet, as though bonds were winter scarves carefully put away in tissue. The clerks who remain make their entries in an admirably clear hand. Ink dries on narrow-ruled lines. Blotting paper drinks the shine from each word until the page looks settled and resigned. A rubber stamp marks one ledger after another. The sound is dull and soft, like a cushion being patted into shape. Closed, closed, closed. The brass grill at a cashier's window reflects a pale stripe of mourning. Someone wraps an adding machine in brown paper and string. Someone else empties an ink bottle into a funnel and wipes the net clean with a rag. The key ring for the vault is heavier than it looks. It lands on the desk with the weight of habit. A junior employee turns each key once in his hand before placing it in a numbered envelope. There is even a sheet for the bank's stationery. Letterheads, envelopes, receipt books, calling cards, sealing wafers, and unused checks must all be counted. Administrative thoroughness has many small hobbies. Louis reads the dissolution notice in silence. The language is flat, exact, and determinedly unpoetic. It manages to make a century and a third sound like a tenancy ending after lunch. Halbwachs has brought a new collar today, or at least one ironed by a less tragic soul than his usual man. Even so, he tugs at it by the time the monocle reaches the second page. The monocle never hurries, which is perhaps its sharpest quality. At the Palais, inventories begin in earnest. The reception rooms still hold the scent of hothouse roses, though the blooms are fading at the edges. Old leather and good tobacco linger in the curtains and the backs of chairs. Inventory men move through the rooms with pencils, tags, and little notebooks that click shut on elastic loops. They measure tables from edge to edge. They note chips in porcelain as if the porcelain has committed a small breach of etiquette. A gilt chair is a line item. A carpet is a line item. A marble bust, a writing desk, 6 side tables, and a rather superior lamp are all escorted into the republic of numbered things. The house reveals its quieter contents under this patient attention. Linen cupboards offer folded sheets with hand-stitched initials. Sideboards surrender napkin rings, fish knives, sauce ladles, and menus saved from dinners long since digested. In one drawing room, they count curtains panel by panel. In another, they measure the depth of the sofa cushion with a steel ruler. A man kneels to inspect a chair leg and emerges dusted with the soft gray of an underfurnished century. The air changes as pictures come down. Cleaner rectangles appear on walls where frames once guarded the wallpaper from light. Dust lifts in slow gold threads and settles on the sleeves of everyone equally. The art lists are long enough to require their own wrapping cord. Each picture receives dimensions, artist, condition, and a value that seems either absurdly low or absurdly confident. The clerks use both kinds of absurdity without choosing between them. Silver is counted by tray, glass is counted by shelf, cellar bottles are counted by rack, and one man seems almost moved by the patient order of the labels. In the wardrobe rooms, suits are listed by color and cloth, evening coats, riding jackets, hats in boxes, gloves in pairs, and a quantity of shirts enter history through blunt pencil marks. Hubert oversees this with the look of a cathedral dean forced to attend a raffle. He cannot stop the counting, but he can improve the folding. He refastens a cuff that a clerk has buttoned poorly. He rescues a silk tie from an unsafe stack and rolls it with such restrained feeling that even the clerk apologizes. By the third inventory sweep, the missing Renoir has migrated again. One list places it in the morning room. Another moves it to the blue salon. A third with cheerful authority insists on the music room. Halbwachs cross-checks the room numbers with a pencil sharpened to a harmful point. His eye now twitches at the outer corner when the picture is mentioned. It is a new movement, and not a flattering one. Louis raises the monocle when the revised list is presented. He studies the paper, not the man. The silence lasts just long enough to make the bare bulb hum seem socially active. The inventory men continue. Rugs are rolled around wooden cores and tied with webbing. Chairs are tagged with stiff cards on string. A large mirror is swaddled in quilted pads that smell faintly of camphor and attic boards. Crates arrive with fresh timber and straw. Tissue paper crackles like dry leaves. Nails are tapped in with brisk little hammers that never become dramatic, because even confiscation must eventually stop for tea. At the Metropole, tea is weak and served in cups that have known better days. Lemon is a memory. Sugar appears only when the universe feels unusually ornate. Louis keeps his routine. He shaves with warm water from a jug. He folds the towel once before using it, as though the fold itself restores a little order to the world. Hubert somehow produces polished shoes on the fourth morning. Their shine could guide ships through fog. He presents them near the bed with the solemnity of a man unveiling a civic monument. Halbwachs notices the shoes and looks genuinely injured by their existence. The Hotel Metropole has many powers, but it does not normally generate mirror polish from thin air. Hubert gives him one mild glance and adjusts a tie knot by half a finger's width. The Wittgewitze papers return in their final form, and therefore more official. New controlling interests are named, old rights are extinguished. Trustees, commissioners, and Reich offices enter the text like guests who plan to stay. There are notices for commercial courts. There are instructions for registry books. There are pages to replace board members, pages to transfer voting rights, and pages to note that all such pages have indeed been received. An attachment lists patent licenses and supply contracts. Another lists insurance policies down to the company and premium. Another concerns wagons, spare rails, machine tools, and rights of way over neighboring land. Louis signs the last industrial schedule with the same hand he used for the first. The clerk's hand dries the ink with a careful shake. For a moment, the page resembles a beach that no one would voluntarily visit. The sum attached to the works is enormous, even after official trimming. It includes furnaces and mines. It includes offices, sidings, inventories, timber yards, locomotives, and the invisible habits that make all those things run on time. No paper can really hold such weight, but it tries. The pages lie flat. The string goes around them twice. The closure of the bank advances with the same dull precision. A notice is prepared for the commercial register. Another is drafted for tax offices. A third records the transfer of premises, fittings, books, and residual claims. Someone removes the desk calendars from the bank and tears away the old dates. Someone empties a tray of paper clips into a labeled envelope, because even paper clips belong somewhere in the empire of acquisition. Order, like parsley, is applied everywhere. A brass nameplate is taken down from a door. The wood behind it is paler than the corridor paneling. The rectangle on the wall looks indecently fresh. In the strong room, shelves that once held bundles now hold little islands of dust. A clerk notes the emptiness just as faithfully as he once noted abundance. Administrative style does not distinguish between feast and fasting. The final ledger is balanced. The ink line under the column is ruler straight. Then the volume is closed with both hands, as one might close a family Bible or a particularly stubborn biscuit tin. Louis asks for no speech and gives none. There is only the page, the date, the seal, and the bank becoming history in phrases so dry they might have been stored with crackers. At the Palais, the inventory spread to rooms no guest ever praised. Pantries, service passages, linen rooms, cloak cupboards, bookshelves, and attic stores all submit to inventory's patient appetite. Household life turns out to be rich in hucks. In the kitchen wing, they count copper pots by diameter. In the still room, they note jars of preserves and bottles of cordial. In the laundry room, they count irons, boards, baskets, pegs, and one missing pressing cloth that Hubert finds within a minute. The grounds are listed too. Greenhouses, garages, garden statuary, gravel drives, iron gates, and lengths of wall all receive estimates. Even the rose houses are reduced to glass area, heating apparatus, and stock. The old scent of the place changes as rooms are emptied. Roses grow fainter, dust grows stronger. The house begins to smell of string, timber, wrapping paper, and the wool coats of strangers. Valuation creates its own odd comedy. A small side table receives a number so exact, it sounds almost affectionate. A painting by a great hand receives one that suggests the valuer had either no taste or a strict lunch appointment. Louis reviews several lists through the monocle. He pauses over a marble figure. He pauses over a silver service. He pauses longest over a carpet, perhaps because carpets have suffered enough without being assigned the wrong decimal. Halbwachs brings corrected valuations on buff paper. Louis reads them in silence. Halbwachs leaves, tugging his collar, which has now become a kind of metronome for official discomfort. Another telegram arrives while a crate list is being checked. London says proceed. Paris says delay. New York says both, in fewer words than seem structurally safe. A secretary places the messages in a neat row on the table. They look like small folded birds with alarming opinions. Louis reads them after the soup. The soup is pale and practical. It contains barley, a cube of potato, and one determined leaf of parsley. The spoon is thin, but it does the job. Week follows week, measured by signatures and sharpened pencils. The clocks in both buildings tick on with admirable neutrality. Dust returns every morning, proving that the world believes in routine. By now, the surrender has its own architecture. There is the industrial stack, tied in green ribbon. There is the banking stack, tied in red. There is the art and household stack, tied in ordinary string, because grandeur eventually meets the stationary cupboard. Together they amount to a dynastic ledger of almost absurd scale. Steel, coal, money, houses, gardens, art, silver, furniture, linen, wine, and the right to put a family name on a door all become surrender in installments. The valuations run into sums that would have stunned a prudent city. They span millions upon millions in official figures, even after every discount and convenience. Yet the true size sits outside arithmetic, in habit, memory, and the long hand of continuity now broken by forms. One afternoon, Halbwachs arrives with the final seizure pages for the Palais. He has arranged them by room, then by category, then by some inward system known only to worried administrators. His cuff bears a stripe of carbon blue. The last sweep is meant to be simple. A few unsigned pages remain, a few disputed room numbers require correction. The missing Renoir naturally has chosen this moment to become more theoretical than ever. It is not in the morning room, it is not in the blue salon, it is not in the music room, unless the music room has recently developed a second wall and better hiding habits. A porter is summoned, then a maid, then another inventory man with a list folded into 16 uneasy squares. Halbwachs's eye gives a small jump each time the word Renoir is spoken aloud. They search without fuss. One checks the picture store, one checks the wrapped crates, one checks behind a pair of screens in a passage no guest ever noticed, because guests are not built for service corridors. There, in a narrow dressing room beside the winter garden, the painting is found at last. It is standing face to the wall behind an umbrella stand and two folding chairs. Someone moved it during curtain cleaning and wrote down nothing at all. The room number on the old tag refers to a servant's plan, not the family plan. The discrepancy has traveled through 3 offices, 2 lists, and 1 twitching official eye. The Renoir itself appears serenely indifferent. Halbwachs closes his eyes for a moment that is almost devotional. Then he opens them and writes the correct location with such pressure that the pencil point breaks. No one remarks on the sound. Louis lifts the monocle and regards the rediscovered picture. He says nothing. The silence is polite, complete, and distinctly educational. After that, the remaining papers seem to know their time has come. Pages are aligned, seals are set out, Witnesses take their seats and test the ink in their pens. The final signature page waits under the lamp in the metropole. The bulb gives everything the color of weak tea, with a decent weight and a margin generous enough to feel faintly old-fashioned. This last page gathers all the others behind it like servants waiting in a hall. Witkowitz is there by reference. The bank is there by closure. The palais is there by inventory, valuation, seizure, and transfer. Louis reads the page once. Then he reads it again through the monocle, more slowly. Halbwach stands at attention with the expression of a man hoping the universe will not add a supplementary annex at the final minute. No supplementary annex appears. The pen is uncapped. The nib touches down. He signs with a hand so steady it seems almost separate from the occasion. The ink shines briefly, then dulls under the blotter. One era ends with a soft press of paper on paper. Halbwach collects the page and checks the signature against the line below, though there is no earthly need. He stacks the folders square, taps them once on the desk edge, and ties the cord tighter than necessary. Outside, Vienna continues with carts, trams, damp pavements, and bakery windows. Inside, 130 years of Austrian Rothschild life have been rendered into bundles that can be shelved. The achievement is bureaucratic, which is to say both impressive and deeply unlovely. Hubert arrives before dawn the next day with a fresh collar and a dark suit brushed to perfection. He smooths the sleeve, adjusts the tie, and removes a speck of lint that only he could possibly have seen. History may lurch, but Hubert will not. The room still smells of soap and paper. Somewhere below, a door shuts, and a clerk begins another day with stamps. Louis stands ready in immaculate cuffs, while the files rest in their cords like finished parcels. Nothing looks grand at the end. The roses are fading, the bulbs are bare, the papers are neat. That is how an industrial empire is surrendered. That is how a bank closes after a century and 3 decades. That is how a house full of paintings, chairs, linen, and family weather becomes state property by inventory number. The sums are vast, the loss is larger. Yet on the table, it is all quiet enough to fit beneath a monocle. It is pleasant to look back at the very end, at the small pictures that stayed bright in this long and oddly tidy escape. There was that May morning when the door of the Hotel Metropole finally opened. Louis stepped out after 14 careful months, beneath bare bulbs and under watchful eyes. The air outside was the same spring air as before, and yet nothing belonged to him in the old way. Vienna still had its paving stones. Vienna still had its chestnut trees. Vienna still had the habit of looking elegant while pretending not to stare. But the city had changed its face with a speed that would have offended any decent tailor. The swastika banners hung where older signs had once minded their own business. Familiar streets now felt like borrowed rooms. The grand world of the Palais Rothschild on Prinz-Eugenstrasse had thinned into memory. One could almost smell the old house again for a moment. Hothouse roses sat in the mind as richly as ever. Old leather and good tobacco lingered there too. Then the picture shifted back to the metropole with its carbolic soap and official dust, and the contrast remained as rude and plain as a slapdash hotel renovation. Another image settles beside it very nicely. Hubert appeared, as men of true vocation always do, exactly where common sense said he should not. 6 in the morning suited him perfectly. The service entrance suited him not at all. Yet there he was with an immaculate shirt, the correct tie, and shoes polished to a level of moral instruction. Political upheaval had made no impression on his standards. Borders shifted. Ministries changed names. Paper seals multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Hubert still held a collar as if civilization depended on the neat line of it. In a way, perhaps it did. The angle of his ironing carried its usual faint complaint. His face kept that expression of professional martyrdom that suggested the world had once again failed to deserve well-pressed linen. That small loyalty felt larger than speeches. Then there was Commissar Halbwachs with his forms. He had entered the story so often, with one more document, that he began to resemble a clerk sent by fate itself. He always brought paper. He never brought ease. Louis always took the sheet between calm fingers and raised the monocle. He read in silence for slightly too long. Halbwachs would tug his collar. The collar tug became so regular that it deserved a place on the family crest. By the end, one could almost hear the poor man rustling before he appeared. He had the air of someone managing history's most catastrophic merger, without any proper filing system. The Anschluss had been, in modern office terms, a hostile takeover performed without an appointment, without due care, and with very uneven penmanship. Haubwachs was left to administer the consequences, and his reward was the steady regard of a prisoner who declined to be impressed. The monocle never hurried. That was the cruelty of it. It turned each demand into an object for quality review. It examined confiscation notices as if checking a disappointing wine list. It inspected signatures as if judging whether the ink itself had been bred well. Nothing in those papers ever improved under examination. Haubwachs, sadly for him, did not improve either. Even the missing Renoir played its gentle part in the nightly parade of bureaucracy. It drifted from room to room on the inventories with the easy freedom denied to almost everyone else. One week it belonged in one salon. The next week it had apparently wandered into another room. Then it moved again by the grace of clerical confusion. By the time it was finally found in its wholly unromantic place, the painting had become less a work of art than a private joke shared by paper, dust, and exasperation. Haubwachs gained an eye twitch from the affair, the Renoir gained legend, and Louis, who had spent a lifetime around important objects, seemed to understand that the little comic failures of paperwork often outlasted the grand claims of power. Then the route westward begins to glow in the mind with a quieter light. Vienna fell behind him. Switzerland offered the first real breath, crisp and careful, like clean linen aired on a cool day. Britain came next with its firm tea and its useful reserve. London also came with the telegram chain still snapping at his heels, like a very well-bred but badly coordinated flock of geese. Cousin Anthony urged acceptance. Uncle Robert warned against it under no circumstances. Somewhere in New York, a nephew managed to recommend both surrender and refusal in so few words that one had to admire the efficiency. The family, in this respect, had invented the group chat before technology was inconsiderate enough to make it portable. Advice arrived from every side. None of it made the road any shorter, yet the road kept moving west all the same, one station and one crossing at a time, until the Atlantic lay behind him and America opened into a different scale of quiet. It is hard not to love the final picture of that change. No palace waits at the end. No ballroom asks to be lit. No procession of callers arrives with cards and opinions. Instead, there is a farmhouse in Vermont. There is weather on the roof. There is open ground. There are practical rooms that do not expect anyone to impress them. One can almost see the mud by the door and the plain table scrubbed clean. New York remained part of life too, but not as a throne room. The old habit of management did not vanish. It merely lost its gold edging. The world had taken the bank in Vienna. It had taken the house. It had taken the formal shape of a dynasty that had stood there for 130 years, arranging credit, collecting pictures, funding music, and lending the city some of its smooth confidence. When that house ended, Vienna lost more than a name on a door. It lost a whole style of urban breathing. A city that had once moved through salons, counting houses, kitchens, stables, music rooms, and long family tables now had one less great household to keep those rhythms alive. The absence was not noisy. It was worse than that. It was neat. Rooms were reassigned. Assets were listed. The paperwork stacked up with smug precision. But a city feels the loss of a family office the way a coat feels the loss of its lining. The outer shape remains presentable. The warmth is simply gone. Through all of it, Louis kept the one thing the Reich could never quite tabulate. He kept his manner. He kept his pace. He kept the unhurried space between insult and reply. He carried composure across borders, the way others carried trunks. In the end, that seems to be the image worth tucking in last. Not the signatures, not the inventories, not even the train timetable. Just a man walking out into a changed city with the same steady monocle, and later choosing plain rooms over grand ones, because the self that mattered had survived the audit. Now the night feels a little warmer for those settled images. The heavy roses, the polished shoes, the Swiss air, and the quiet Vermont rooms can rest together very gently. And the monocle, faithful to its small duty, stayed steady to the last, as if bad paperwork still deserved a proper look. May your dreams be free of surprise audits, unsolicited hostile takeovers, and monocles that fog at the worst possible moment. May no one ever hand you 14 months of paperwork before offering you a cup of tea. May the Renoir always be exactly where the inventory says it is. Thank you for listening. May your thoughts stay easy, and good night.